8 New York. I wrote every afternoon at Lazzaro's house. The ideas flowed from an exquisite inner source. I felt I held the key to living a full life, and this lay in liberating myself from structures. I defended the thesis of breaking ties because I experienced the existence of an inner light, which shone on its own, and which had previously been obscured by veils of conditioning, habits, and structures. I used that word constantly, and shared my discoveries with everyone. I continued to attend the lab, and I saw Astucia almost every day, but I avoided seeing Lizette. Ionel came to Lazzaro's house, and I continued to go out with her. Our relationship was temporary. She was about to leave for England, and I was leaving for New York, having received a scholarship from Conasut National Council of Science and Technology. When I closed my eyes, my mind filled with images. I saw scenes from different countries, houses, and many eyes. Years later, I learned that the sign of a break with one's personal history is the appearance of images of eyes, which at the time I had only seen, unaware of their meaning. The wall I had always felt inside my mind had broken, and I could see through it. I loved the internal images I perceived. Each one was original, perfect, and in color. Countries appeared, and parades in London and Paris, complete with crowds. I flew in the air, seeing cities below me. I entered palaces and houses, and was transported back to other times. I walked through medieval villages and attended ceremonies of all kinds. I soon learned to control the images, zooming in or out of scenes and houses. I could penetrate pupils at will, or travel into outer space. I told Ionel about my inner adventures. One afternoon I took her back to her house, and she asked me to drop her off 2 blocks away. She didn't want Chuck to see her with me. I was furious. I was transparent and embarrassed by nothing, and she wasn't. We stopped seeing each other until I couldn't stand it anymore. I had gone to the movies, and a film with a little girl in it reminded me of her. I stood in front of her apartment and called her. She came out, and I started crying, telling her I loved her more than myself. Several days later, Ionel attempted suicide. He ingested a lethal dose of barbiturates and spent 3 days in a coma, with Chuk by his side praying for his recovery. Chuk had told him that his behavior was destroying an exemplary marriage, and Ionel couldn't bear the guilt. I ran into her several days later at the university, and she told me about her experience. I was shocked and didn't see her again until she said goodbye to me. I gave her a London-New York plane ticket, which she never used. I met Anne, a beautiful and strange girl, the daughter of one of Mexico's greatest cardiologists, a student of Ignacio Chavez. I fell in love with her. She took me to her home in Cuernavaca. One night, uncontrollable tears burst from me. I became frightened and felt something very evil was inhabiting my mind. Every day I discovered experiences I had always denied myself. I began attending gatherings that young people called reventons. I wrote down all my discoveries, including them in stories, tales, and meditations. I felt alive and free for the first time. Everything amazed me. Everything was new and delightful. I felt filled with magic and enchantment with every person I met. One day I realized that the world of objects did not exist externally as such, but was created from brain activity. I excitedly told Lazzaro this, but he didn't understand. Every day I arrived at his house with a new discovery. Lazzaro saw me and mocked me. One afternoon I told him about an image I was seeing with my eyes closed. It was in space, very far from Earth. I saw a gigantic asteroid with a bright spot on its surface. Since I had already acquired mastery of my internal visual world, I decided to approach the spot, and it became a gigantic building with a colossal dome in its center. I entered it and found myself standing in front of an observatory full of stars. When I finished the story, Lazzaro told me that my eyes were open. I was terrified and touched my eyelids. They were closed. I trusted everyone blindly. I was a newborn baby beginning my learning process in life, and I was certain that everyone knew more than me, since I had always lived within limiting structures. Ian had helped me crack one of them. At Lazzaro's house before his trip to England, I was able to share some memories of my mother, and when I expressed guilt, she told me that I had been a boy, and that I shouldn't feel guilty. My trip to New York was almost ready. I had been accepted to pursue a doctorate at New York Medical College, and Roy John was willing to give me a place in his laboratory. I had given Triller's 3 manuscripts and promised to send him more from New York. I said goodbye to Father Pardo and Teresa. She had graduated as a psychologist a few days after her father's death. I had accompanied her to the hospital and supported her in her grief. I arrived in New York on the 4th of July. On the bus that took me to Manhattan, I sat in the back seat and felt alone. I didn't want anyone to see my face, wet with tears. From the hotel, I called Roy, and he picked me up in a gigantic Cadillac. He told me it wasn't his, but his father-in-law's, and that he didn't belong to the capitalist class. He was a socialist, supported Cuba, which he visited every 6 months. He was considered the father of Cuban computers. He spoke to Castro informally and taught him neurophysiology. He had been a soldier during World War II, and upon returning to America, had joined the Communist Party. His build was robust, and his almost bald head was adorned with a beard that protected a mouth with energetic lips. His appearance radiated power and confidence, and his observation about the Cadillac captivated me. He was accompanied by Miriam, his wife. He had met her at the University of Chicago while working in Fermi's group, building the world's first nuclear reactor. He had been a physicist before becoming a psychologist, and his work in neurophysiology was internationally known. He took me to Alfredo and his family's home, where I was fascinated to be surrounded by such extraordinary people. It was a Chilean family with an astonishing history. Alfredo had collaborated with Castro during the Cuban Revolution. He and his wife, Sonia, had lived in Cuba for years. When Allende came to power in Chile, they returned to their homeland and supported him. The last year of his government witnessed a complete transformation in Alfredo. From a convinced communist, he became a kind of Christian mystic that no one understood. His classmates at the University of Santiago viewed him with suspicion. They believed his conversion to Christianity meant a rapprochement with the United States. When Pinochet killed Allende, Alfredo became a sure target for the military. His past in Cuba and a time in Czechoslovakia marked him as a declared communist. In his home, he owned one of the largest Marxist libraries in Chile. One afternoon, the military searched his house and couldn't find the books he and Sonia had previously hidden. But they did find a Cuban flag, which they mistook for the emblem of Puerto Rico. For Alfredo, this was a miracle performed by Christ, which strengthened his faith. Days later, the Chilean government received a telegram from the New York Academy of Sciences inviting Alfredo to the United States. It was the work of Roy John, whose maneuver saved the family from certain arrest. They told me their story while we ate in their dining room. Alfredo asked me if I had any prejudices. I told him I didn't know, and he informed me that they didn't exist in his house. Then they led me to my room. The Hudson River was visible from the window, and I felt profoundly happy. I could smell the sea, and the scent of the vegetation refreshed me. The next day I went to the lab and met Robert, who impressed me with his intelligence. Working in his lab was Eric, also a physicist like Roy, but now interested in understanding how the brain works. Both Roy and Eric were Jewish like me, and I felt close to them. Robert began showing me the lab computers, and Roy showed me the archive of records. a veritable collection of hundreds of tapes recording the brain activity of thousands of animals during complex learning processes. Since PhD classes wouldn't start for several months, I assembled a recording team and began designing an experiment with Roy's help. At night, Sonia would sit and draw, Alfredo would read the Bible, and their 2 sons would accompany them, while we all listened to music. Sometimes Robert would come over to play chess, Eric would come over to chat, or Roy would come and think out loud. Roy's 50th birthday was celebrated with a party attended by all his friends. There I witnessed one of the most fascinating scenes. Roy stood at a chessboard, arranging the pieces according to the guests' moves. It was his party, and he presided over it like a king on his throne. I admired him greatly, and I decided there that I wouldn't pursue my PhD, but would stay in his laboratory. A few days earlier, I had visited Valhalla and met with my future teachers. They had all disappointed. I didn't tell Roy until I had obtained sufficient experimental data from our experiment. This involved electrophysiological recordings of the human brain during processes of assigning meaning to geometric stimuli. We aimed to differentiate the areas responsible for conceptual decoding from those that analyze the geometry of the stimuli. The results were satisfactory, and Roy supported my decision. The lab was highly stimulating, and the people who worked there were brilliant. They all smoked marijuana and wrote books and articles about the experiments. Eric was very interested in developing a theory that would allow him to understand how the brain creates internal representations of visual images. We talked for hours about the latest discoveries in the neurophysiology of perception. One day he confessed to me that what he really wanted was to create a superconscious computer, because he had come to the conclusion that the evolution of the human brain had already reached its limits, and that it seemed primitive to him. Eric asked me if I had experiences of cosmic isolation. He defined these as sensations of being a tiny, insignificant individual, alone and isolated within the universe. When I refused, he was amazed. He told me ironically, experience that very often. He added that such experiences were necessary, and that anyone who didn't have them was either blocked or lacking much development. I felt bad listening to Eric. On the one hand, I felt more primitive than he was, but on the other, I felt that the experiences he was referring to denoted a pessimism I didn't want to share. One afternoon, walking near Central Park in New York, he sighed and said that it was just another day, as if the existence of days were an irremediable and painful repetition that would have to be endured. I mocked him, patting him on the back as a sign not to think about such things and as a sign of affection. Eric's seriousness toward life, his pessimistic sighs, and his great intelligence always moved me deeply. At Alfredo's family home, he read to us from the Bible and offered mystical interpretations of New Testament passages. We all listened to him with great pleasure, but I began to notice that he didn't listen to us with the same attitude. There was always the feeling that he considered us less evolved than he was. He talked a lot about his complete liberation from structures. One night I couldn't stand it anymore and stripped completely naked in front of everyone, as a challenge. I invited them to do the same, and they were shocked. I went back to my room feeling like I had won a battle. Eric meditated and taught me how to do it. I loved him, but his desire to build a machine better than the human brain had made me wary. One day, he invited me to see the largest computer in New York State. Standing in front of its consoles, I felt a mortal hatred. A few hours later, all the machine's safety systems had failed to prevent a total breakdown of its electronic innards. When Eric told me this, I smiled, and he stepped away from me in astonishment. Roy was developing a very sophisticated recording system, and I sometimes accompanied him to perform brain operations on the laboratory cats. He viewed the living brains of his animals with a love and admiration that were more illuminating to me than all the experiments. He called me over to view the cortical surface of a cat through a dissecting microscope. "Look," he said, "the most wonderful miracles in the universe happen in there." In that environment, I began to think deeply. I didn't understand how the quality of experience was created from brain activity. When I rode the subway, I saw people's heads and imagined the electrical activity in their brains and the appearance of images with their colors and textures emerging from them. Mysterious transformations must occur between brain activity and experience, and I wanted to discover them with all the strength of my mind. One afternoon, at Roy's house, I confessed my predicament to him. He smiled at me and said something that gave me the clue to begin my search. He too was asking himself the same question. He told me that it was necessary to consider unifying transformations of brain activity. The most important was what he called the hyperneuron. According to this idea, the totality of all brain activity is a hypercomplex energy distribution that acts as a Gestalt energy field. That observation was enough to initiate a marvelous process in me. I went to the planetarium, and as I looked up at the starry sky, I imagined the brain and neurons as stars interacting with each other. Both the brain and the starry sky were the same, a set of energized points interacting and creating hypercomplex energy fields. I thought then that the universe had consciousness, just like the one manifested in the human brain. I bought a racing bike and rode it everywhere. I'd been told to be careful in the Bronx because there were a lot of muggings, but I didn't care. I'd take all the alleyways, eat pizza at Latino stands, and get into the habit of zipping down Broadway, regardless of the danger. Around that time, I started to miss Astucia a lot. Every time I saw a little girl, I thought of her. I mentioned it to Miriam, who told me I shouldn't hesitate to bring her and her mom to New York. She offered to help me with that. A very strange girl began working in the laboratory. She couldn't walk properly, and her face always wore an ironic smile. I was told she had attempted suicide by jumping from a third-floor window to the street. She broke all her bones and, amid terrible suffering, had spent a year recovering in a hospital. I was captivated by her. I taught her to ride a bicycle and talked with her about life and death. She possessed an uncanny ability to see her own internal processes. For example, when I gave her a pencil, she was able to follow the creation of the image and the appearance of the object's name in her mind, being able to discriminate the temporal sequence of the creation of both experiences. One day we were alone in the family home and smoking marijuana. 5 minutes later, a police car appeared. They entered the house and I saw myself being arrested and sent to Mexico for illegal drug use. Instead, they accepted some cookies and a glass of milk, chatted with us, and then left as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The girl had pressed an alarm button and called them. When I asked her the reason for her behavior, her ironic smile appeared, accompanied by a shrug of her shoulders. Roy John would know why, she told me mysteriously. Every day, as I rode my bicycle to the lab, I saw a very strange man. He had a gigantic head, was completely bald, and looked like a homeless person, although his facial expression was that of a thinker or philosopher. I ran into him on each trip on a different corner. Sometimes when I was riding the subway, I saw him at a station, or while walking home. One afternoon I couldn't stand it anymore. There were too many encounters, and very strange coincidences. I went into a flower shop, bought a flower in a pot, and approached the man to give it to him. He saw me with my arms outstretched, clearly in the act of offering it, and said something that left me frozen. "It is not necessary." That was the last time I saw him. Robert asked me to be a subject for one of his experiments. I accepted, and he took me to his laboratory, where he placed electrodes on my head. He was astonished to see that half of my brain was in alpha activity and the other half in beta. He asked me how I felt and if I knew how strange my brain activity was. I told him I felt normal. He stated that it was my responsibility to understand the meaning of my own activity. His words made a great impression on me. The lab was located across from Central Park in New York City, in a building that used to serve as a hospital. In the mornings, I would go and greet the admissions officer. She was a very kind old lady who told me that I didn't belong in this world, that I lived outside of time and space. I thought she was referring to my internal images, although I had never spoken to her about them. Her comment and Robert's made me feel very strange. Sonia, Alfredo's wife, had a dog with whom she got along wonderfully. They played together, ate together, and slept together. A Chilean woman, a refugee from Pinochet, came to their house. She, along with Alfredo and Sonia, insisted on my need to try LSD. I refused, until I finally agreed. One Saturday afternoon, the woman and I took a dose. The experience was terrible. 30 minutes after ingesting it, I was fighting God in a mortal duel that lasted 8 hours. My entire story appeared in it, but so concentrated and symbolized that I couldn't understand it as such. At the end of the trip, I sat down to describe it in a story I titled The Dialogue, which I reproduce at the end of this book. This experience deeply upset me. If I missed Astucia before, afterward, my pain at not seeing her and my guilt for having left her in Mexico became unbearable. I spoke to Miriam for support and went to Mexico. I arrived at Lizette's house and cut my finger. With the blood, I wrote her a note telling her I couldn't live without her and the baby. I left it on the table and went to take a shower. Lisette came into the house and started screaming. She made it to the bathroom and, seeing me alive, breathed a sigh of relief. She immediately agreed to go to New York with Astucia. While she was preparing the trip, I returned to New York and found an apartment, bought an old mattress and a table, and settled in to wait for Lisette and Astucia to arrive. We lived happily for 2 weeks, but soon Lisette and I began to argue. I felt like she didn't understand me, and I felt like I was living, once again, inside a prison. In a small closet in the apartment, I set up a chair and a table and locked myself in to write New Principles of Physiological Psychology, a book I was preparing to send to Trillers. For several hours, I worked in my closet, and then opened the door to breathe fresh air for a few minutes, and then locked myself back in. I felt so alone and disconnected that I decided to stop talking. For a week I remained silent, while Lisette and Astucia asked me what was wrong. Eric arrived at the lab one day, carrying a bag full of peyote, which a Manhattan taxi driver had given him. He asked me if I wanted to try it with him, and I agreed. Eric was a specialist in surprises. He invited me to parties that he tried to make permanent, but without success. He and a friend hung charts on the walls, recording the frequency of the guests' conversations. They said they could analyze the dynamics of the party in order to detect patterns and influence them so that the party wouldn't end. They had managed to extend one for 7 days. At one of his parties, he invited me to listen to a recording of the Earth's magnetic pole shifts, recorded over a year and reduced to a few minutes. He wanted to know my reaction and experiences upon hearing them. He introduced me to the changing seasons and the Earth experience. We arrived at my house with the package of peyote. We were going to make a peyote smoothie with orange juice. We drank it and sat on the floor to wait for the effects. They didn't take long to appear. Suddenly, mid-conversation, my movements began to slow down. Every gesture I made spoke to me of its origins up to 3 generations earlier. I spoke. I knew the origin of my voice from my grandfather, the movements of my hands, my grandmother, and so on, in general, with all my behavior. Nothing was mine, everything came from my ancestors. Peyote had made me aware of the genetic origin of my behavior. I was shocked to realize that practically nothing I did was genuinely mine. I decided to remain motionless. Lisette arrived halfway through the session and sat down to observe us and listen to our comments. The deterioration of our relationship was noticeable. We barely spoke without our conversation ending in an argument. Estucia attended kindergarten, and we tried not to raise our voices around her. One afternoon I couldn't stand it anymore. Something told me Lisette had gone too far, and I decided to separate from her for good. I waited until she came home and told her. Lisette had found an art school where she was studying painting. She looked me in the eye and left without a word. I later learned that she had spent that afternoon with Robert. I was left alone with Estucia. In the mornings, I took her to kindergarten, and from there went to the lab. I worked there for a few hours, and then returned to pick up Estucia. I was conducting an experiment on newborn monkeys. Sometimes, I invited Estucia over, and she would bottle feed them while I calibrated the recording equipment. I almost never saw Roy, and during the year I worked in his lab, he never helped me with an experiment. The lack of direct contact and the pressure from Estucia began to drive me crazy. Along with the chimpanzee experiment, I was conducting another experiment in which I attempted to measure temporal discrimination at different frequencies of human brain activity. My ideas had led me to postulate the existence of a duration of the present and a neuronal field, resulting from the interaction between all the neurons in a brain. This latter proposition had its origin in Roy's concept of the hyperneuron. I continued to be intrigued by the question of how brain activity transforms into experience. I began to suspect the existence of an interaction between the neuronal field and space as a necessary step for the emergence of visual images. The laboratory was visited by many important figures, including agents of the American government. Roy had been offered a large donation if he would dedicate himself to developing a device that would use the thought of a military aircraft pilot to trigger the firing of weapons. Roy had refused. On another occasion, a paranoid individual had accused him of electrically controlling his mind from the laboratory. The truth was, we were planning an experiment to control the brains of animals by injecting them with electrical currents of specific morphologies. But that man's accusation was completely unfounded. I met Carl Pribram, who visited us and spoke with Eric about visual perception. All of this was very exciting, although it became increasingly clear to me that the emergence of consciousness from brain activity was a question that contemporary physiology wasn't prepared to answer through experiments like the ones we were conducting. I used to walk the streets of Manhattan while thinking. Sometimes I went to Greenwich Village to listen to Oriental music and watch a Moroccan drummer. Sometimes I went to listen to a group playing jazz. As a writing exercise, I forced myself to describe the group's music. The organist was the result of the experiment. I bought a clarinet that Roy taught me to play. I'd sit on a park bench and play it for hours, watching the people go by outside and my thoughts inside. One afternoon, I was walking near the Central Park, when as I passed by a street, a building caught my attention. I entered and was amazed by its decorations and the signs next to the elevator. They spoke of a guru. I went up the stairs and entered a large hall where dozens of people were seated in front of a very dark-skinned man with glasses, who spoke to them in an unknown language, translated by one of his students. It was Swami Muktananda. People came up to him and asked him questions. 3 men asked him about the functioning of the brain. I paid close attention. They told him they wanted to record his brain activity with a machine. Muktananda laughed and asked them if their machine could talk. They said no. He then replied that he wouldn't allow himself to be recorded by a machine he couldn't talk to, that it was useless. I was astonished. He seemed to be talking to me and giving me an indication of my own thoughts. Afterwards, Muktananda laughed again and said it was very curious how, when we saw another person, we considered them a different self from ourselves, and the other person did the same with us. When it was over, everyone sang, and then the lights went out. I left dazzled. The experience inspired a story that was published in the Vehicle of Transformations under the title The Man. See stories at the end of the book. I picked up Astucia, and at 7 p.m. I spoke to the director of Conosite in Mexico. I told him I was disappointed with physiology, which I found incapable of answering the question of the emergence of consciousness. I told him that if I kept my scholarship, I would commit in Mexico to writing 4 books dedicated to Conosite on the subject of the physiology of consciousness. To my surprise, he accepted my proposal. He told me that my call had coincided with a meeting where they were discussing precisely the ability of science to unravel the mystery of consciousness. The next day, I told Roy of my decision to return to Mexico. He expressed his regret because he had never had a more intelligent collaborator. He asked me to work together for 3 days so I could understand how he set up his experiments. He was perfectly aware that part of my decision stemmed from our lack of contact. I told him I was very grateful, but that it wasn't necessary. I told Lizette of my decision and told her that I was taking Astucia to live in a small town in Mexico. Strangely, she didn't resist. I said goodbye to Eric, who gave me a large aluminum kite. I spoke to my father, asking him to let me live in his house with Astucia for a few days while I looked for a place to live. He refused, telling me he had a wife to take care of and that my staying in his house would cause him problems. I called Hilda, my cousin, to ask for help, and she offered me her house. In Mexico, I went to Tepoztlan and found a house, where I ended up living with Astucia. I had decided to go there because I remembered Gustavo finding peace in that town in the state of Morelos. I picked up Astucia from Hilda's house, and while passing by a newspaper stand in Mexico City, I read that astronomers were amazed by the appearance of a supernova star they had detected that year. A thought suddenly appeared in my mind. I had no doubt about the existence of neural fields and their interaction with space. Wouldn't it be possible to explain the changes I was going through, the sudden thoughts that appeared in my mind, and the moments of inspiration I was experiencing as related to that supernova? 9 Tepoztlan. The nights were cool and filled with the sounds of insects. I would put Astucia to sleep in her room after telling her stories. In the living room, I would listen to the night and sometimes light the fire in the fireplace while I thought. I had committed to writing 4 books and pondered their content. I was worried about Astucia. I had to find a kindergarten for her, and I didn't know if the contrast between New York and Tepoztlan would negatively affect her. For my part, I had no doubts about my ability to write. Every moment was filled with thoughts that continued to flow endlessly from an inexhaustible source. It was all about organizing and putting them on paper. Trillis was still interested in publishing my books, so it was just a matter of patience and organization. I liked the house I had rented. It was perfect for Astucia and me, with its garden, its comfortable rooms, and the help of a Tepoztlan woman who had offered to cook for me and do my laundry. Suddenly I heard a noise that caught my attention. It was coming from my room. Days earlier I had found a large tarantula on Astucia's curtain, and now that noise alarmed me. Very carefully I got up from the armchair in front of the fireplace and turned on the light in my room. Above the curtain, a huge animal could be seen, at least 5 times the size of the tarantula. I ran for a broom and approached. Just as I was about to squash it, I realized, horrified, that it wasn't an animal at all, but a human hand. I opened the curtain and found a man trying to get in through the window. I told him to leave, and he calmly and naturally asked me to let him in to spend the night inside the house. I refused, realizing that someone was holding him from the street. I couldn't raise my voice for fear of waking Astucia. I lied to him. I told him I would open the grill for him if he came down from the window. He agreed and disappeared. With a racing heart and sweating, I went to sit on the couch. I listened to the night sounds and realized that no other sounds were added to the insects chirping. The next morning, I took Astucia to the village kindergarten. We introduced ourselves to the headmistress, and I offered to help with the teaching. Astucia was admitted, and I was allowed to teach a class every morning. We walked hand in hand at 8 in the morning, crossing the streets of Tepoztlan, amidst the song of hundreds of cicadas, which made the road oscillate, as if it were a tunnel of deafening vibrations. That's how we arrived at kindergarten. I told the children stories and then went for a walk in the mountains surrounding Tepoztlan. I had a flute with me, and from the mountains I could see the reddish roofs of the houses and hear the distant shouts from the market. I wrote a short story that reflects that period of my life, which I've reproduced at the end of the book. I titled it Interna. At 12 noon I stopped by Astucia, who told me what she had learned. I admired my daughter for her courage and adaptability. She didn't complain about anything, except for the neighbors who didn't want to play with her and who had very dark skin. I began writing a novel about a hypothetical character, Alexander Sisto. It was about contemporary life seen from the future. They criticized us and were shocked by our customs. Alexander Sisto had been our leader after the Third Great Catastrophe. He had helped humanity rise again from the radioactive ruins. After lunch, Astucia would go play, and I would go write. Thus passed the weeks in the calm of Tepoztlan, amidst its lush vegetation and its long heat, sustained by the songs of insects. One afternoon, 2 women came to pick me up. They were sisters from Argentina. The eldest, Bryce, listened attentively as I recounted my experiences over the past few months. Her interest seemed so genuine that it moved me, and I began to explain the neural field hypothesis. She took me by the shoulders and shook me. "Better make love to me, not to the words," she said, leaving me frozen. He practically dragged me into the street. According to her, I was supposed to know a painter named Rita, with whom I would surely get along. We arrived at a house surrounded by thick coffee trees. It looked like an enchanted forest, full of scents and some plants with gigantic leaves. We were greeted by a beautiful, tall woman with very long blonde hair. She painted perfect paintings next to a gigantic fireplace. She was American and lived with her 2 children. Her husband had died in an accident. I was immediately captivated. We sat by the fireplace and talked for hours. I was saturated with the energy that Rita radiated. I had never met anyone like her. I visited her every day, and our conversations were endless. She saw strange beings coming to visit her house. They perched next to her fireplace, and gigantic beings watched her while she did the same, fascinated by the apparition. Rita spoke of remote places, enchanted villages on high, inaccessible plains. I explained my ideas about the brain to her. Little by little, my world transformed. Without realizing it, I was drawn into a universe filled with magic and strange events that I couldn't explain. My daughter, however, kept me grounded. I loved her dearly, but I began to realize that she missed her mother and that I couldn't raise her properly. One morning, some university students came to visit me. With them appeared a girl with light green eyes I had met before. Her name was P, and she seemed to belong to no other world. I invited her to Tepoztlan, and beside a waterfall, I realized I had fallen completely in love with her. I told her in a burst of sincerity I had never felt before. The incomparable sound of the water falling on the river stones framed her feline beauty as I declared my love for her. She looked at me and smiled, her eyes reflecting the sun. I knew she had to be mine, that my life had changed, and I had no choice but to convince her to live with me. I spoke to Lisette in New York and convinced her to return to Mexico to take care of her daughter. I invited P to Puerto Escondido, as if some supreme power prevented me from doing anything else. We slept in a small tent by the sea. P let herself be petted, as if her nature were not human but feline. We made love, crazed with pleasure. We visited the beaches of Puerto Escondido, and found one completely unspoiled. We swam, and when we got out, we ate some small red fruits that grew on a tree on the shore. We were poisoned, and I felt it was an omen, but I didn't say anything. We cured ourselves with garlic and rest, lying in the sun on the beach. P had been my student at the Faculty of Psychology a few months before I left for New York. She had attended the farewell party my friends had organized for me. At that gathering, while we were all lying on the carpet, chatting, I had looked at her and suddenly felt like I was capable of flying. I began to lift off from the ground until my body rose at a 45-degree angle. Everyone was astonished, while I remained in the air for a few seconds. I gently descended and landed back on the carpet. On that occasion, P slept with me and I spent the whole night watching her eyes, illuminated by the moonlight that softly penetrated through the window. In Puerto Escondido, I once again entered his gaze. P agreed to live with me in Tepoztlan. At night we made love and fell asleep embracing. During the day I devoted myself to writing. We liked to watch the fire in the fireplace, sitting completely naked, a few inches from the reddish embers, imagining shapes in them, and in the flames that rose dizzyingly from within. Those flames defied gravity, just as I had. The sight of their fiery movements, their dizzying pulse as they moved away from Earth, made me think that their anti-gravity nature must be associated with the extraordinary amount of information they contained. In my search for the origin of the experience, I had come to the conclusion that the brain activated a hypercomplex energy field, which must be similar to those flames. Something in that neuronal field could be capable of exerting an anti-gravity influence, and that would explain my flight. I sensed that this something would have to be associated with an increase in information, and I prepared to try to repeat the experience of flying. I bought an inflatable mattress and connected a thin, clear plastic tube to it. I filled it with colored water and lay down on it. For weeks, I watched the water level and tried to change it by inducing changes in my consciousness. P looked at me in disbelief. I failed. I realized that P couldn't stand inconsistencies. I had published several books attacking restrictive and homogenizing social structures and defended my views to Andrea, who began to criticize me when she noticed that much of my behavior didn't match my ideas. I set out to become perfect, but I was losing patience and despairing. One night I spoke to her about the self and my longing to reach a state of perfection. She didn't understand me. She criticized the term self and considered it derived from a fantasy. I looked at her in astonishment and confusion. I was sure she thought the same as me, and suddenly I realized I had idealized her too much. Like a red-hot knife, I woke from a dream and remembered Astucia. I had left her for this woman who didn't understand what was most sacred to me. I was about to ask her to leave, but I restrained myself. It was too late. I didn't realize that in that moment I had decided to pay for the terrible guilt I felt. Something inside me terrified me, and without understanding what was happening to me, I remained silent. It was my mother and Astucia, both with the same name and the same destiny. I was a monster and I had to suffer. We traveled to Huautla with some friends. We ate mushrooms, lying on the floor of a hut with stick walls, through which the light of the full moon filtered. After a few minutes, I started feeling strange and decided to walk through the mountains. I got up and, feeling dizzy, went outside. Almost lost, I returned to the hut and lay down next to P's body. As I hugged her, my hand took on the consistency of melted plastic. It extended without my consent and penetrated through P's chest, piercing it. She did the same, and we played a fun game of making holes in each other, lengthening and shortening our bodies at will. After what seemed like an eternity, I suddenly found myself outside my body. I was traveling through space and decided to visit some friends. I found them at their home in Mexico City, frolicking on their bed. I positioned myself in the corner of their room and watched them. Then I returned to the mountains and entered my body. The bodily distortions had disappeared. Instead, thousands of thoughts and images appeared in my mind in an overflowing, endless stream. After several hours, I tried to end the process and return to normal, but it was impossible. Frightened, I raised my arm and noticed lines of light on it. It was the moon. When I moved my hand, the lines transformed into animals. I showed P the trick, and together we created a zoo, until dawn arrived. Upon returning to Tepoztlan, I abandoned my levitating mattress and took refuge in my books. I wrote down everything that came to mind and gave it psychophysiological form. I would lock myself in a room for hours while Andrea watched me lying on a bed. When I got tired, I would hug P and bury my head in her chest. I got some hallucinogenic mushrooms, and one afternoon we decided to trip together. We went to bed, and when I closed my eyes, I saw myself inside a temple. A bearded, long-haired figure was arguing with some rabbis. They were wearing robes, and I suddenly realized I was in Jerusalem and that this figure was Jesus. I followed his monologue and marveled at his words. Suddenly the scene changed, and I saw a cross with the same figure nailed to it. I was about to understand something, but at that moment, P interrupted me. She was crying desperately. Her face was flushed, and she was begging me for help. I tried to return to the image and what I was about to understand, but it was impossible. I consoled her and forgot about myself. The following days I spent wandering the streets of Tepoztlan. On a corner, I saw a painter with his canvas in front of him, surrounded by chickens. I approached him while I was observing his house. It was a quaint, poor adobe construction. We introduced ourselves. His name was Ted, and he was obsessed with the possibility of including the third dimension in his two-dimensional canvases. He talked to the chickens, claiming to have learned their language. I was captivated by his originality and invited him to our house for hot chocolate. He taught me how to place cans outside to hear the melodies the rain awakened in them. He fell in love with P, and I was overcome with fierce jealousy. P swore to me that she had no interest in him, and I calmed down. Friends would come to visit us, and every time they knocked on the door, I would interrupt my writing and welcome them. P would criticize me for it. His father was also a writer and never entertained anyone. I explained to him that I was different, but he didn't understand. I became friends with Ted, and he invited me to meet John. He spoke of him as a great character who lived in the Tepoztlan Valley, confined to a wheelchair. One morning we went to visit him, but found him asleep. My curiosity to meet him grew. He had written the Tarot of the Age of Aquarius, and financed the hippie movement of the 1960s. Along with Hubbard, he had founded Dianetics and lived with an African tribe, where he had been initiated as a shaman. He had worked as a dancer for a while in the United States, and after a performance, upon leaving the theater, He found a woman half-starved and lying in the snow. He took pity on her and took her home. Upon entering the kitchen, he threw everything off the table and lay down on it. She entered a trance, and a male voice spoke to John, who watched the scene in amazement. The voice claimed to belong to a Tibetan monk who had tried to contact John but had so far been unsuccessful. He ordered him to marry the woman so he could continue receiving messages. He agreed. I found him one bright morning, sitting in his wheelchair next to a pool in his garden. He was preparing a whiskey and greeted me kindly. His body was distorted, with tiny legs and a magnificent head, from which deep eyes meditated. She told me about her life. After her shamanic initiation, she decided to return to Europe, but the members of the tribe prevented her from doing so. She escaped and received a gift at the train station. It was a tribal scarf that caused her a burning pain. She was bewitched. He traveled to Switzerland and stayed at Krishnamurti's house. A Swiss doctor diagnosed cancer in his shoulder, and within a few weeks he became paralyzed. He had written the tarot while receiving messages dictated by a Ouija board. I was captivated. I asked him about the existence of consciousness, explaining that I believed its emergence was the result of the interaction of two forces. He looked at me angrily. "There is only one," he said, piercing me with his words. I became his disciple and admirer. I took P to meet him, however. She couldn't resist his energy. She warned me that evil resided within him. I later learned he was homosexual and an alcoholic. I lent Ted a pair of binoculars so he could sketch out details of the Teposteco. I didn't see him again for several days. One early morning there was a knock at the door of the house, seconds after it had shaken from the vibrations of an earthquake, whose epicenter had occurred in Chile. It was Ted. He came in sweating and hurried inside. He told me to close the door quickly, and as I did, I saw the silhouette of a man and a light coming from a flashlight. He told me he'd been kidnapped by federal agents, who, upon seeing the binoculars, suspected him of drug trafficking. They blindfolded him and tortured him for 3 days and 3 nights, burning him with lit cigarettes. They demanded a confession. Ted was an atheist, but after 72 hours, he prayed to God for help. He saw angels descend upon his captors, who released him. He didn't want to live in Tepoztlan anymore. We took him to P's parents' house, who helped him return to his country. I later learned he lived underground in New York City, feeding on rats. He gave me his first 3-dimensional painting, in which a full moon rises, illuminating a plum tree. P and I gazed into each other's eyes while we made love. The pleasure was indescribable, and P's beauty was infinite. However, our conversations began to feel redundant. I didn't dare speak of the self again, and instead, I listened to P ramble on about completely inconsequential aspects of reality. I told her it was superficial, and she defended her own world. It began to suffocate me, and I replaced my frustration by buying a Jeep. The friends I had gone to observe outside my body came to visit us. We went on a hike through Teposteco. We found statues of gigantic faces carved into the rocks. We knew they weren't natural, because in one of them we discovered bricks embedded in a rock mixture. I played the flute for them. I'd become quite adept at it. I'd spin around while watching the lines of the mountains. If they rose, I'd raise the pitch. If they fell, I'd lower it. In this way, I created a melody that represented the valley and its mountains. During a break, they confessed to me that they had had a supernatural experience. One day, 2 weeks ago, while they were lying in bed, a light had appeared in their room. The light seemed to be watching them, floating in one of the corners. I asked them the date of the event and realized it coincided with the trip to Huautla. In the Jeep, P and I traveled, observing the landscape and talking about the beauty of the clouds and the color of the sky. In the mountains of Oaxaca, we found a charming little town, San Jose del Pacifico. Amidst a magical mist and at the foot of the mountain pines, we once again traveled with mushrooms. Once again, I was immersed in fantastic scenes, accompanied by the clouds, while P cried for help. I didn't understand the reason for her suffering. I sensed a terrible emptiness in her soul, and once again I hugged her and pulled her out of her abyss with all my strength. I told her everything was fine, that the world was beautiful, that nothing was as terrible, and I managed to make her smile. She looked at me gratefully and laughed. I returned to San Jose del Pacifico often, both with and without P. Once I decided to talk to the clouds. I sat on a mountainside overlooking a magnificent landscape filled with pine trees, mountain peaks, and clouds drifting between slopes and valleys. Everything was connected, and I was part of the landscape. I engaged in a dialogue with the clouds, the ants, the mosquitoes, and the mountains, and I wrote about my experience in the prologue to the book The Awakening of Consciousness, which I reproduce in the narrative section. The writing was written during the actual experience and attempts to introduce the reader to the same state of consciousness from which it emerged. They sold us 2 cabins, and we decided to return to them often. On the return trip, we passed through a ravine surrounded by mountains. We had binoculars with us. Something in the atmosphere was heavy. It seemed like someone was watching us. I stopped the jeep and got out to investigate. With the help of binoculars, I found a cave on a hillside. Its entrance was carved out, and next to it, I saw 3 people. They entered the cave and disappeared. I started the jeep, and after a short distance, I saw the 3 people again, but on the side of the road. I hit the brakes and with a quick breath, grabbed the binoculars. It was them. They were wearing the same clothes. Suddenly, one of them vanished. We slowly approached the other 2. We got out of the jeep and were stunned. They were an old man and a young man. The old man was dark-skinned, like an Indian, but with green eyes identical to P's. We approached, and the old man welcomed me. "We've been waiting for you," he said. We loaded him into the jeep and headed to a charro arena. Everything seemed unreal. Some horses and their riders were running bulls. One of the charros amazed me with his dignity. The old man invited us to see his house. The floor of his room was tilted 30 degrees. Pictures of triangles with eyes hung on the walls. His bed was kept horizontal, supported by legs of unequal length. The old man sat on his bed and offered us 2 chairs. We sat at an angle of the same 30 degrees as the floor. The old man began to speak. He told us that a few years ago, while he was working the land, his horse had been frightened by a snake. He galloped off, and since he was tied to the saddle, she dragged him across the field until he died. He began to ascend to heaven, asking God for mercy and begging him to let him live longer. God agreed, and there he was, alive and talking to us. P and I looked at each other, and in a secret eye language, decided to leave. We were very confused and scared. We said goodbye to the old man, who made a face of disgust and questioning. We got in the jeep and stopped at a restaurant. P dismissed the whole episode as a fantasy, and I hated her, regretting not staying with the old man. On my way back to Tepoztlan, I saw Rita again. I had interrupted my conversations with her, and our reunion was filled with all the concepts I loved, which didn't exist with P. I was torn in 2. The days I talked with Rita were all ideals and abstractions. With P, everything was superfluous and empty, except for love and pleasure. David visited Tepoztlan. P and I met him at the Serena Castle in Cuernavaca. We had been invited to a party hosted by the castle's owner, Ana Luisa, who lived there with her daughter Mune. In a large hall, adorned with a gigantic stone fireplace, an enormous gong brought from China, and medieval paintings, David gave a demonstration of telepathic communication before a sophisticated audience. Rita had accompanied me, and as we were leaving the meeting, we discovered the Jeep had lost its handbrake and was hurtling toward a ravine. I ran and managed to stop it with the help of the attendants, who mysteriously appeared and disappeared. We had left our Tepoztlán address with David, and he showed up there to invite us to a course he would teach in the town. We offered our house and invited our friends. I'd been introduced to Sarah, a mature, beautiful, gypsy-looking woman. I convinced Sarah to participate in the course, and it changed her life. She had devoted herself to her daughter, painting and spinning on a loom, but after David, she devoted herself to esotericism and astrology. David taught us how to navigate past lives, communicate psychically, and handle healing energies. He had an assistant who clearly served as his lover. In one lesson, he said that no human being liked their own body. His was flabby and chubby. P protested she loved hers. A few days after the course, a long-haired, bearded man showed up at our house accompanied by his girlfriend, a slim, sensual girl. They had come from the United States looking for a UFO expert. The university had given them my address. I looked at him in amazement. I didn't consider myself an expert on these objects. I had never even seen one in my entire life. He looked at me inquisitively, and at that moment I remembered my childhood fantasies, but I didn't say anything. We spent a week together. He told us that while searching for evidence, he'd ended up in Canada, where he met a woman who received messages from extraterrestrials. The craft landed in her backyard, leaving footprints in the snow. The California Black Witchcraft Club had followed his lead, trying to prevent the interview. The lady and my new friend would place a tape recorder on the table and turn it on without a microphone. As they listened to the tape, they heard voices. On one occasion, a voice told them that at a certain time they should go to the forest to receive a direct message. They went, and at the scheduled time, 4 lights appeared in the sky. They changed color and direction abruptly, forming a perfect square, but they left no message. I looked at my friend in surprise and rebuked him. The message was the movement itself. Only a 4-dimensional body, interacting with a 3-dimensional space, could make such movements. My friend scratched his beard and looked at me with an expression of admiration. He seemed to tell me that, despite my doubts, I was indeed a UFO expert. He then showed me a diagram he'd put together after several messages. It was the structure of a sophisticated device designed for healing. It consisted of 2 electromagnetic field emitters interacting inside a pyramid. I was excited. I told him that for years I'd been studying the possibility of field interaction in the structure of the brain as a basis for trying to explain the emergence of conscious experience. My friend looked at me again with the same expression as before, and confessed that he was already in communication with an extraterrestrial, who had his base of operations on Jupiter. I remembered that Rita had mentioned one of Jupiter's moons as the base for a human colony that the extraterrestrials were helping to build to save the chosen ones on Earth. Now I was the one who scratched my beard, and I asked for evidence. "You'll have them tonight," he replied mysteriously. When the moon rose, we headed to Tepoztlán. We climbed part of the mountain and sat on a rock. My friend focused and asked for evidence. A few minutes later, a light appeared in the sky and began moving in various directions. No matter what happened, I would visit Astucia every weekend, and the rest of the time I wrote. One Saturday, on the way to Mexico, my mind fell silent. I was enveloped in a fearful darkness, in which there were no thoughts, ideas, or ideals. I was terrified. I had never imagined that the flow of cognitions could cease. I banged my head with my hands, as if trying to restart a stuck clockwork, and after a few minutes I began to flow again, Lisette was waiting for me at Astucia's house. When I saw them both, I knew abandoning them had been the biggest mistake of my life. I wanted to tell them, to ask them to take me back, but I kept quiet. P was waiting for me, and my destiny was to suffer. P asked me about Rita, and I sensed her jealousy. It increased day after day until after each visit, an impossible argument awaited me, one I couldn't end. Desperate, I searched for a way out. My intention to fly gave me one. I knew that doing so with my whole body would lead to another failure. I went to consult with John. We sat on the porch of his house overlooking the garden. On a rock next to his pool he had placed a branch in the shape of a snake. He listened and told me that his wife could fly but without a body. His technique consisted of visualizing his body curling up into a tiny ball around his head. Then, he would look for an opening in his skull and jump through it into space. According to John, the technique was foolproof. One night during World War II, his wife had traveled from the United States to Paris. The city was in flames, and she woke up with her body burned. I tried for 2 months, but failed again. In P's world, human emotions and suffering occupied a prominent place. She criticized my books, finding nothing in them but abstract ideas and idealizations. Her criticisms were accurate, but when mixed with resentment and jealousy, they provoked repulsion. P would insist for hours and I resisted, until I begged her to let me sleep. She continued, and I felt a heart-rending scream building in my chest, unable to emerge. I agreed to stop seeing Rita in order to end the arguments. We moved from Tepoztlan to a neighborhood near Cuernavaca. We lived in a magnificent house with a large garden and an ice-cold pool. The owner rented it to us, complete with a gardener, but when we couldn't pay him his salary, we fired him. He took revenge. He hired a witch doctor who made us feel like we were on a knife's edge. He threw dead birds into the garden and surrounded the jeep with shattered glass. One morning, a dead bird appeared next to the steering wheel. I went to ask Don Lucio for help. I had met him a few months before, but I no longer visited him because P had forbidden me to. To her, he seemed false and conceited. To me, however, he was a great teacher, shaman, and director of the Graniceros lineage of the state of Morelos. His vision of reality was filled with inorganic spirits living in space and traveling ethereally from one place to another on the planet. I met him one stormy night. An anthropologist had given me his address after I asked him for a weather expert. He wrote about the subject, echoing Albert Einstein's ideas and incorporating them into a psychophysiological framework. I found Don Lucio charming. His dark-skinned body and his utterly pure indigenous laugh captivated me. He spoke to me about the weather, but about atmospheric weather, and told me he was capable of controlling it. He told me about his initiation as a shaman. He had been struck by lightning, after which he remained in a coma for 3 years. His body didn't move, but his spirit traveled with the time workers who taught him to heal with herbs and to manage lightning and storms. I was fascinated by his world and asked to be initiated into it. During a magical ceremony, he lit 12 candles and asked the time workers to guide and protect me. I told him about the gardener's maneuvers, and he promised to help me ward off his influence. P and I played ping pong every night. We were able to modify the ball's trajectory during flight and competed for control. Those matches became hair-raising. The ball abandoned all laws of physics, and we rejoiced in our learning. My writing ability reached its peak. I would sit at a table with 4 notebooks open and write simultaneously in them. In one I would invent stories, another would be a book on psychophysiology, the third on philosophy, and in the last, I would describe the functions of consciousness. He moved from one book to the next in a delightful dance. An example is the story The Game, sea narrations. Despite Don Lucio the gardener ended up breaking all our defenses and we returned to Tepoztlan. I set out to investigate the Tepozteco caves. In one of them, I found a wall filled with perfect human figures, their right arms extended, pointing down a path. I followed him, fascinated by the discovery. The path wound between the figures and ended in a gigantic queue, clearly blurred by a colony of whitish fungi. I didn't know the meaning of the queue, but I started meeting a young American with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a long beard. Every time I passed by the Tepoztlan Plaza, I saw him standing on a corner. My curiosity grew, and one blue morning, I introduced myself to him and invited him home. His name was Daniel, and he lived in Amatlan, a town located 5 kilometers from Tepoztlan, the mythical birthplace of Quetzalcoatl. We became friends. He taught me how to move pins using the power of my mind. We learned to communicate with the Tepozteco pyramid using a Ouija board. We received messages signed by 2 characters, Q and T. We assumed they were Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca. I had become interested in astrology when I realized that both P and Lizette were born in July and belonged to the same sign, Cancer. Daniel turned out to be my astrological twin, just as Quetzalcoatl was Tezcatlipoca's. During those days, Miguel appeared. He was a filmmaker hired by the dominant political party to prepare José López Portillo's presidential campaign. He told me that Portillo believed himself to be Quetzalcoatl and gave me 2 of his books, Don Q and Quetzalcoatl, which I read, predicting a portent. I thought I should help make Quetzalcoatl's return possible. I met Anne. She was a friend of John's and felt destined to pave the way for the new age. She poured mercury into a flask and spent hours observing its interior, trying to detect messages. She knew astrology and smoked marijuana all the time. She was a Sagittarius, like me, and we hit it off from the first moment. She wanted to record our conversations and gave me a wonderful title for a book, Pornographic Metaphysics, which, however, I never used. She told me that she and John could make the water in the garden pool boil simply by using their thoughts. As always, P didn't like Anne and criticized her harshly. Despite that, I continued to see her. I announced that I would establish a psychic research center, to which I invited Sarah, Rita, Anne, and my other friends. Among them was Huge, a German immigrant who always radiated an atmosphere of paradoxical mystery. On the one hand, he was kind and hospitable and treated everyone with kindness. But on the other, he seemed to harbor a series of macabre intentions, which one guessed within him, although they never surfaced. He boasted that members of his family had been close friends of Hitler's lawyer, and he defended Nazi Germany, offering moving but absurd arguments. I saw him alarmed, and all my upbringing and Jewishness rebelled against him. Nevertheless, I was seduced by his kindness and constant praise. He said I was a mixture of Dr. Faustus and Goethe. P helped me distribute the course brochures and eagerly attended the sessions, in which we developed the ability to read the hidden history of objects. We explored each other's past lives. As they manifested in our eyes, we read tarot cards and consulted the I Ching. We competed to increase our telepathic sensitivity and read the messages of the Akashic records. John was dying, while the group sent him healing energies. One of John's sisters came to visit him. She was a splendid old woman who adopted me as her son. Outside John's house, millions of fireflies used to trace luminous filigrees on the nights I visited them. I was amazed by the patterns they wove, but she corrected me. The fantastic thing is precisely that they don't create patterns. I learned from her that her brother belonged to the Sufi order, and that the Turkish leader of the lineage had commissioned him in Tepoztlan to balance the energy of the Western Hemisphere. After a lifelong conscious agony, John died from a hemorrhage in his shoulder, which had caused him to bleed to death. They had tried to stop the bleeding, but he forbade it. His last words were of gratitude, because he was finally going to know what existed in the other world. Days before, I had convinced him to be visited by Don Lucio. I had never seen Don Lucio nervous before or since. He performed a cleansing on John and announced that his spirit had been scared away in Africa. John was astonished, but he did not allow him to be healed. During the funeral, one of the Sufi leaders appeared and taught us how to meditate on the seeker and dance the whirling dervish dance. The day after John's death, the group decided to contact his spirit. We failed, and all we achieved was to arouse the distrust of John's protege, a Tepoztlan youth, who later turned to witchcraft. I continued writing and developing hypotheses about brain organization and functioning. One of them stated that convergence was fundamental to the development of linguistic logic. P and I developed a tarot reading method based on the brain's convergent circuits, using John's Age of Aquarius tarot cards. P became friends with one of the session participants. She changed completely from that moment on. Her friend convinced her to leave me alone. The issue of independence was added to our regular arguments. I was enraged to realize that what I should have done months earlier but didn't dare was now being done by P. After a huge argument, we decided to separate. P returned to her parents' home in Mexico, and I stayed in Tepoztlan. Across from the house was a yogi monastery, which I would occasionally visit. One day, one of the yoginis showed up at my house, her face flushed from crying. Her name was Mim, and I had admired her wrapped in silk, like an odalisque, while she was doing yoga. She told me that the monastery's guru, a dark-skinned man with thick lips, had invited her to his house and raped her there. Now she could no longer live in the monastery. Every time she saw the guru's photo, she remembered his erect penis penetrating her. I consoled her, and we became friends. She moved into a house near mine, and I would visit her there every night. She enveloped me in a kind of bubble, from which I couldn't escape. Her room was entirely Muslim, with brocade, curtains and Arabic ornaments. A meditation group was formed in John's memory, and there I met another girl who said I must have come from another planet, although I no longer remembered. Sarah studied astrology day and night and confirmed to me that the Earth didn't appear in any of my zodiac signs. I had written not 4 but 6 books, which I proudly submitted to CONOCYT, National Council of Science and Technology. The Faculty of Psychology at the National University hired me full-time, and I was ready to return to Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. I rented a small house on a hill off the old highway to Cuernavaca. From there, I could see the lights of Mexico City and remember John's Firefly Field. I couldn't sleep well, I couldn't rest, and I detected a terrible negativity in everything and everyone. No one understood each other. What was clear and commonplace in Tepoztlan was considered esoteric and crazy here. At the university, I began to conduct experiments. I attached recording electrodes to myself and tried to monitor my brain activity. Soon I had students, and we began to study the electrophysiological correlates of the experience of time. I missed P a lot. I went to visit her and convinced her to live with me again. We rented a house in Coyoacán and decorated it to our liking. After 2 delightful weeks, the arguments began. I was teaching a course on creativity at the university, and the students began visiting our house. P would come up to her room and reproach me for paying more attention to them than to her. Again, I felt trapped. Desperate, I sought psychoanalytic help. I went to consultations 3 times a week, but couldn't verbalize what was happening to me. The psychoanalyst insisted that I should continue my relationship with P, while I asked him to help me become independent of her. At the same time, I learned to meditate at the Maharishi Center in Mexico City. On the rooftop of my house, I decorated the utility room with oriental motifs and placed a gigantic pyramid on its roof. I meditated for hours every evening, letting myself go without control or restraint. My mind, during meditation, was completely different from the one that manifested outside of it. I discovered areas of marvelous mystery that eluded me the moment I opened my eyes. Try as I might, I couldn't remember what I had seen, but I had the impression that there existed a parallel world to the one I was entering, much more meaningful and powerful than the one of my daily waking life. I felt that it was in this parallel world that the decisions that later materialized in this one were made. I also began to scrutinize the silence. Nothing was missing there, and nothing existed, but simultaneously everything was there. I thanked Maharishi. I hung a portrait of him on one of the walls. My greatest wish was to preserve this state of silence permanently. To achieve this, it would be necessary to establish an institute where I could devote myself uninterruptedly to its exploitation. When life's desires are genuine, they come from a stratum in which their fulfillment has already been decided, as if waiting for individual consciousness to realize their existence. From that moment on, events overflow like a waterfall, and what one desired happens, although not necessarily exactly as one imagined. In a course I took with my psychoanalyst, I met one of the Lopez Portillo family's nieces. We became friends, and when I told her my idea for the institute, she arranged for me to meet with her aunt Margarita. She was the sister of the President of Mexico, headed communications for the country, and lived in Los Pinos. I showed up one afternoon, and the guards allowed me in. I was impressed by the luxury of the presidential residence. Margarita greeted me with a dozen acupuncture needles embedded in her head. She looked at me and went to get some porcelain plates. On them, a portrait of one of her ancestors appeared. She told me I was identical to her great-grandfather and listened with interest to my intention to create the institute. He promised to help me and asked me to teach him how to meditate. We met again a week later. We were drinking coffee by some windows on the 2nd floor of the Lazaro Cardenas residence. Dozens of enormous cages filled with birds accompanied us, and the birds' songs, along with the beautiful view of the pine garden, punctuated our after-dinner conversation. Margarita was chatting with one of her friends, whom I felt suspicious of. She had a German accent, and her every gesture betrayed arrogance and discomfort. Suddenly the conversation was interrupted by a sudden, deafening noise. It seemed as if all the birds had agreed to sing in unison. The German woman began to scream in fear, and Margarita and I looked in every direction, searching for a cause. At that moment, we saw her. She entered the living room, covered in a shawl of small balls. She was plump, short, and her face displayed a deep spiritual tension. Margarita stood up and introduced her to me. Her name was Pachita, and for some reason, her presence had triggered the birdsong, as if they had welcomed her. The German woman kept shouting, ordering a waiter to cover the cages. Pachita sat next to me, and we looked at each other. One of her eyes was much larger than the other. I later learned that she was practically blind and used an extraocular technique to see. Her presence emanated a powerful yet tender and maternal energy. She rolled up her shawl, deliberately revealing a threadbare sweater. She looked at Margarita and complained, "Why are there so many taxes? Don't you realize the town is starving?" Margarita became nervous. She replied that it wasn't her fault, but that she would tell her brother to see what could be done. A butler dressed in a frock coat offered Pachita a porcelain cup of tea. "Bring me some coffee from the pot," she said to the waiter, who was speechless. The scene was fantastic. This woman had been greeted by all the birds with a spectacular welcome, and now, in the house of the President of Mexico, she demonstrated incredible strength and determination. Pachita realized I was looking at her with admiration. She came to my side and in a whisper told me that whenever I needed her, I should go see the Popocatépetl and Ixtlachihuatl volcanoes and pronounce the name Xochitl. "I will help you," she continued, "and I also invite you to visit me at my house so you can see what I do." Afterward, she said goodbye to everyone and, on her way out, greeted the Lopez Portillo family's German shepherd. She spoke to him like an old acquaintance, while the animal drooled with delight as he gazed at her. I also said goodbye, and the following Wednesday I went to the appointment. I recognized the house from the directions Pachita had given me. Dozens of people were lined up on the street. Some were waiting in wheelchairs. Others were on stretchers or leaning on family and friends. An ambulance was parked on the corner. I knocked on Pachita's door and wasn't allowed in. I got into my jeep and meditated. At the precise moment I felt myself in the silence within a bluish hue. They called me. The little brother says, "Come in." I was surprised by the name and the synchronicity. I entered a garage full of sick people. A girl in a wheelchair caught my attention. She had been decerebrated by excessive anesthesia administered by a careless doctor during an operation to remove her tonsils. She looked like a vegetable, lying motionless and completely limp in her chair. I was invited into a smelly, semi-dark room. Bodies wrapped in sheets lay on the floor, while in the right corner of the room, Pachita sat in front of a rustic bed. I introduced myself with "In the name of the Father, I greet you," which someone had instructed me to say when I entered the room. Pachita responded with a similar phrase, uttered with aristocratic dignity and in a masculine tone of voice. I was invited to stand next to Leo, Pachita's assistant. A woman entered, whom Pachita greeted with great affection. She invited her to lie down on the bed, and Leo immediately cleaned her stomach. Pachita raised an arm, and someone offered her a hunting knife. Leo ordered me not to move. Pachita took the knife and, without inhibition, plunged it into the woman's stomach. Blood began to flow. Pachita stretched the wound with the knife, while I struggled not to scream. Suddenly, I thought it was all a farce. The knife was made of rubber, and the blood was tomato sauce. As if she'd heard my thoughts, Pachita took my hand and inserted it into the open stomach. It was warm and moist, and I could feel the woman's internal organs. I understood that this was real. For a moment, I was stunned, but then I told myself that this was consistent with my ideas about experience as a result of the creation of the neuronal field and its interaction with space. On the other hand, it demonstrated the existence of different levels of reality. Then they moved on to the brainless girl. We laid her on the bed, and Pachita opened her skull. She inserted the knife into the brain and cut a piece of cortex, which she removed, separating it from the rest of the brain tissue. He then took a piece of tissue in his hands and breathed into it, ordering it to live. "Live, live," he shouted. Then he inserted the transplant into the brain and closed the wound. I watched the scene, dumbfounded. Leo showed me how to close wounds by placing my hands on top of them and sending energy into them. This was called saturating. That night, I saw a dozen operations and asked to return. I attended the operations for several months. Pachita transformed before beginning them. She would enter a trance, and her body would assume an aristocratic, dignified, masculine, virile, and powerful posture. Everyone said that the spirit of Cuauhtémoc, the last of the Aztec emperors, occupied her body. In that situation, Pachita's body performed miracles with matter. She made it appear or disappear at will. She divined my thoughts and knew the content of my dreams. An intense thought began to occupy my mind. I knew, I don't know how, that I was there not to found an institute, but to establish a bridge between Cuauhtémoc and Quetzalcoatl. I separated permanently from P and stopped attending the psychoanalytic sessions. I didn't see Margarita again until a long time later, and I never received any help for the institute, other than Pachita's presentation. All day long I thought about Pachita and wrote about my experiences with her. Cuauhtémoc seemed interested in me describing what was happening to Pachita and encouraged me to write in flowery language. May your golden pen write many papyri. Never let anyone make you doubt what you see. Your book will be a success because in it you describe the truth of what your eyes see, he would tell me between operations, when we had time to talk between the intervals of one patient and the next. I began to admire Cuauhtémoc's personality, his courage, his poise, his compassion, and his tenderness. He told me about his life as emperor, and the terrible conquest he and his kingdom had been subjected to. In the university laboratory, I felt absurd performing antediluvian experiments compared to what Pachita was doing. All my ideas, theories, abstractions, and idealizations were childish fantasies compared to the reality I witnessed alongside Pachita and Cuauhtémoc. One day, an extraordinarily luminous presence invaded Pachita's body. I felt it was identical to the one I saw in Jerusalem, speaking with some rabbis during a mushroom experience with P in Tepoztlan. Pachita said that I had been the Apostle Andrew, and that my teacher had left me a task to accomplish during this life. I understood that it concerned the problem of the creation of conscious experience. I also understood that my experiences with Pachita would help me resolve a concern that intrigued me, and that dealt with the question of the relative or absolute nature of individuality. Were there many of us or not? Was our self separate from other selves, or did we all form a single entity? I wondered whether the individual self was permanent or not, and the existence of Cuauhtémoc seemed to support the possibility of the survival of individuality after bodily death. However, I sensed that what we call individuality is illusory. Perhaps the personal self was merely a manifestation of a truer unity? Cuauhtémoc didn't want to hear about Quetzalcoatl. He said it was because of him that Tenochtitlan and all of Mexico had been conquered. I tried to change his mind, but it was all in vain. Pachita was invited to operate at Los Pinos. She entered a trance in a room where Margarita, her friends, and several generals heard Cuauhtémoc predict the worst calamities for Mexico. The president wasn't present, but it was Quetzalcoatl's house, and I sensed a desire for revenge in the Aztec emperor. I challenged him, to the astonishment of the court of Quetzalcoatl. I told him that the misfortunes he was talking about were actually being brought about by his speeches. He replied with something terrible that I can't remember. I wrote 2 books about Pachita and Cuauhtémoc. When I finished the first manuscript, I took it to Pachita and read a few chapters to him. She listened to me with delight and amazement because, according to her, she didn't remember anything that happened during the operations. She jotted something down on the first page, using characters that looked Japanese. At the end, the calligraphy transformed into the syllable flow. Immediately, she made a strange movement with her hands, and in one of them appeared, materialized, a tiny oil painting signed by Flow, depicting a path that disappeared into the distance, surrounded by peach trees in bloom and 3 birds flying. She handed it to me. "It's a gift they sent you," she said with satisfaction. The painting was oval and framed. I left the manuscript with her for further reading, and the next time I saw her, I asked for her impressions. She replied that she hadn't received any manuscript. I reminded her of this, and she said she would look for it. 3 days later, I received a call from the president asking me to come to Margarita's office. Upon entering, I saw my manuscript on his desk. I reproached her for the theft, and she apologized, saying she wasn't guilty but that a friend had brought it for her to read. She asked me please not to mention that she had met Pachita at Los Pinos. You know, Jacobo, that would cause us very serious political problems. She asked me because of our friendship, and I agreed. A week later, upon entering the operating room, I realized my place was occupied by someone else. Brother Cuauhtemoc asked me if my interview with Margarita had been difficult. I told him yes. After the operations were over, Pachita confessed to me that she had been threatened by the presidency. They told her I could no longer work with her, and that if I did, one of us would die. I told her not to pay attention to gossip, but she insisted on the seriousness of the warning. I left Pachita's house and never saw her again. Sometimes I think the real reason she asked me to leave was because I had submitted to Margarita. Meanwhile, I was teaching at Anahuac University, dazzled by the beauty of my students. I fell in love with one of them. When our eyes met, I divined thousands of memories from the past. She was frightened because Andrea Pujaric, Uri Geller's mentor, had visited her house and alarmed the entire family with the news that the Soviet Union was bombarding the Western Hemisphere with ultra-low-frequency electromagnetic fields designed to sicken capitalist minds. I told her it was nonsense, and she insisted I tell her mother directly. I started visiting his house. Over the past few years, his mother had been meeting with a group of psychics, and together they received messages from a man named Daniel of the Mountain. I told them that Daniel was my friend and lived in Amatlan, the town where Quetzalcoatl was born. They begged me to bring him to Mexico City to meet him. When I told him, Daniel's eyes opened wide, and he agreed. I dropped him off one morning and picked him up that evening. I found him sitting in a chair surrounded by his admirers. He told me that they had treated him as if he were the Messiah, and he didn't know whether to believe it or not. I told him that if he were, I would have to play the role of Judas. We laughed and meditated inside a pyramid in my house. That night, I felt like my body had become the battlefield between two powerful opponents. I woke up exhausted and told Daniel about it. We stopped seeing each other, and in the meantime Pachit died. 2 or 3 months earlier, she had asked me to return to her side to continue working with her. But I had refused. I ran into Daniel again on the streets of Mexico City. He told me he had attended the group sessions, and that during one of them, he had been asked to go see Pachita. Daniel cast his mind toward the meeting, and found Pachita surrounded by a gigantic shadow holding a clock. As Daniel Quetzalcoatl approached her, Pachita saw him, and they embraced. At that moment, the shadow dropped the clock and disappeared. We called Pachita's house to ask about the date of her death. It was a match. I published the books about Pachita, and my colleagues at the National University began to think I had gone crazy. Memo, Pachita's eldest son, called me at the lab and threatened to sue if I didn't agree to give him money. I was furious. In the books I offered a truthful and praise-filled description of his mother, whom he truly loved. I told him so, but he didn't care. He hadn't even read them, but a few weeks earlier, in a television interview, he had said that there was no truth in them. He called me again, but more politely. His financial situation was dire, and he asked me for help. I agreed and gave him part of the profits from the books. Lizette had moved to Tepoztlan with Estusha. They rented the house Rita had occupied, and when I visited, I remembered the magic of my conversations with her. I bought a piece of rustic land in a forest near Mexico City and lived there for a year, completely alone amidst the pine trees and spiritual presences that kept me awake at night and restless during the day, in a cabin I had built myself. The energy of the place saturated me, and soon I became so identified with the forest that when a lumberjack cut down a tree, it hurt in my own body. It was located 5 kilometers from the village where Don Lucio lived, and I would visit him frequently. We would sit across from each other, and after looking into each other's eyes, reminisce about past lives. Don Lucio had been a samurai in ancient Japan. I saw him in his attire, with his sword, and he told me he was a warlord. He recognized me in Poland as the owner of a property where he had worked as a gardener. These sessions reminded me of Sarah from Tepoztlan, with whom I did something similar, using astrology, the pendulum, and tarot cards. Sarah and I intended to trace our entire lives in order to build a genealogical tree, on the branches of which we could locate our reincarnations, and on the trunk, our true selves. One day, Don Lucio lent me the heart of his table. I held it in my hands and saw a large white castle floating in space. I entered it and found a magnificent being seated on a throne. Don Lucio asked me for details. Is it on the left or the right? What color are the columns? I couldn't stand the energy of the forest anymore, and Don Lucio agreed to cleanse it. He brought copal and balsam and told me that there were hundreds of spirits who considered me an intruder. I had spent all my savings building the cabin, and to get there and go to teach at the university, I had a small moped, which I would pedal along the road in a sweaty mess. My life became a living hell. No one understood me. At the university, they whispered about me, and I couldn't rest in the cabin. My paternal grandmother died in the meantime. She had spent her final years in a nursing home, where she only talked about money and didn't recognize her own children. My father inherited a fortune and 2 buildings on Condesa Hill. He gave me an apartment and a car, and I returned to Mexico City. Upon entering my new house, I realized the gift came at a price. I was occupied by all the energy of my family's ancestors. I fought with them and tried to convince them to leave me alone. The phone rang suddenly, and on the other line, an unpleasant presence snorted as I answered. I had had too many supernatural experiences, and in a burst of lucidity, I decided to become normal again. I wouldn't see Don Lucio again, and I wouldn't go to my cabin. Instead, I would dedicate myself to teaching, working in the laboratory, meditating, and practicing yoga. I became a vegetarian and dressed entirely in white. I bought a shortwave radio, and after my meditations, I would listen to the BBC in London, relating my internal experiences to world events. I was convinced that my evolution had led me to develop an extreme sensitivity, and I began trying to modify the events I heard on the radio. Every time a disaster occurred somewhere in the world, I would focus my attention on it and try to resolve it. I also took on the task of absorbing the pollution from Mexico City. I used breathing exercises and internal cleansing meditations to achieve this. When I finished, I went outside and noticed that the smog had disappeared from the building where I lived, and for several blocks around it. I contacted the Department of Ecology and offered them my technique. They looked at me strangely and politely declined. One day, I received a phone call from a television station. They needed my help for a program. I attended and met Teresa, who worked there. The program featured children who were able to see with their hands. They were blindfolded and made to tell time on clocks, read printed text, and describe color photographs. I couldn't detect any tricks. After the program, I proposed to the trainers and teachers of the technique that we use it to teach blind children how to see. With the help of my brother Nathan, I organized a program at the Coyoacan Incident School. The teachers came to train the blind children, and I supervised the results. They refused to teach me their technique, even though I swore my intention was purely for assistance and science. Some children began to detect images, but the project was interrupted because the teachers stopped attending. I learned to love and admire those blind children. One in particular impressed me. His body was completely deformed, and his eye sockets were filled with blood and pus. His features were horrible, but inside him lay the kindest and brightest soul I've ever known in a child. 11 Cuernavaca. 4 years passed. I read Eastern literature and admired India and Tibet. During that time, based on a discipline consisting of yoga exercises, meditation, and complete asceticism, I began to feel extreme peace and an ability to be accompanied by a kind of inner light that nuanced all my thoughts and behavior. I realized that no material or economic goods existed outside of me that could give me the happiness and satisfaction that my inner self provided. At the same time, synchronicity began to become a daily and constant occurrence. I realized that everything was connected and formed a single being of which I was a part. Everything within me and around me had meaning. When I went out into the street, I recognized the state of the collective consciousness and set myself the task of changing it. Everything was so clear and easy to understand that I was amazed by its simplicity. I wanted everyone to be able to realize what I was, because I was sure that I hadn't established contact with a portion of my individual personality, but with the source from which everyone drew their consciousness. It was undoubtedly the best time of my life, and I decided to seek a favorable environment to continue and deepen my understanding of it. To achieve this, I lived in a yogi monastery that had been established in Cuernavaca. It housed the former directors of the branches of the organization of a yogi who had been a student of Sivananda of Rishikesh and dedicated himself to creating yoga organizations around the world, abusing his disciples and exercising tyrannical control over his employees. Desperate, they decided to separate from their guru and, following the advice of Andrea Pujaric, moved to Tepoztlan and later to Cuernavaca. They meditated every day, practiced yoga, were vegetarians, and communicated with Master, the spirit of Sivananda, through a medium. I lived with them for several months, longing to visit India. My daughter attended school in Cuernavaca, and I decided to join them as a third-grade teacher to see her more often. I taught the children math and Spanish, and at every opportunity we all went out to the garden to play and explore nature. A little girl followed me everywhere. One morning, I suggested she learn to see with her hands. I remembered some comments from the blind children, and based on these and some yoga postures, I began her training. I blindfolded her, and after 5 minutes, she began describing a photograph from a book to me. I checked the blindfold and found it perfectly opaque and without holes. The next day, the girl was able to read a text fluently. The other children in my class were curious and sat around us. Within 2 weeks, 80% of the school children had extraocular vision. They competed with each other and developed fantastic skills. They read each other's minds, saw in 360 degrees, and 2 children discovered they could see inside their classmates' bodies. The school principal became alarmed and called me into his office. He felt there was a latent danger in what I was doing. They'll think they're different from other children, and that could lead to problems, he told me seriously. A girl learned to move objects from a distance. She destroyed several vases in her home, and the principal's complaints were joined by those of the terrified father. I suspended the training, but the children continued on their own. They went into basements, and using extraocular vision could perceive everything in complete darkness. One girl sat with her back to the blackboard and copied everything the teacher wrote on it. A strange boy named Peter arrived at the monastery. He complained constantly of back pain and at night climbed onto the monastery roof to explore the sky. One night I followed him. He alternated between exploring the sky and using his watch, and then wrote some notes in a small notebook. Quartz crystals were used during meditation at the monastery. Master had instructed us to use them to amplify consciousness. I too began using them with surprising results. Lisette lived in Tepoztlan with a man, his 3 children, and Estucia. Maria, the daughter of Lisette's partner, attended the same school as Estucia, and also had ectopic vision. One afternoon, she blindfolded herself and started watching television. She asked me for my crystal and excitedly told me that the image had become clearer and 3-dimensional. Maria's intelligence was superior. She read every book she could get her hands on and boldly asked me surprising questions. She read my books about Pachita and began to sense Cuauhtémoc. One day she told me she had a message for me. We sat on the grass and invited Estucia. Maria closed her eyes and told us that Cuauhtémoc was very pleased with what we were doing. I doubted it was Cuauhtémoc. I asked him, and his answer astonished me. I am, he said, a portion of Maria's unconscious personality. Maria's father spoke to the school principal, and together they banned me from continuing with those sessions. I became friends with Peter. He confessed to me that he admired Pujaric and had lived at his institute in New York. They communicated with extraterrestrials, and one night Andrea had convinced him to let them implant him. Peter agreed, and during a nighttime operation, they screwed an invisible instrument into his spine. It would help him communicate more clearly, they told him. From that day on, his back pain began. During nocturnal stellar explorations, he established contact with his mentors. He possessed a secret code. The hands of his watch changed position when he received messages. He would write down the angles and mail them to Pujaric. Pujaric would translate the angles into letters of the Hebrew alphabet, then decode the message, and send it back to Peter at the monastery. I offered to help him. I asked my children to see the inside of his body, and they agreed. Peter showed up at school one morning, and 3 children described a cube bolted to his spine. From one side, a tube protruded, ending in a sphere. Waves traveled through the tube. Peter told the children about his experiences with aliens, and we organized a trip to a valley that, according to Peter, served as a landing base for spaceships from other planets. The children were happy, and from the next day they came to class with drawings of spaceships and dreams full of messages. Fearing the worst, I went back to teaching them math and Spanish and avoiding any mention of aliens and flying saucers. I decided to return to Tepoztlan and rented a house that Estucia often visited. I stopped attending the monastery and went back to see Rita. She taught me to paint, and we resumed our conversations. But something had changed. We were more mature and careful. I dedicated a story to him based on our experiences. See the stories section. Sarah had become a great astrologer. I visited her almost every night, and we exchanged knowledge for hours. I was amazed by her acuity and mastery of symbols. We experimented with our memories and read pendulums and tarot cards. My maternal grandfather lived in the Cuernavaca nursing home for the elderly. I visited him on weekends. One afternoon he saw me and uttered the last word of his life, Besht. I realized he was referring to Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism. From that day on, every time I visited him, we would gaze into each other's eyes for hours without speaking. When I had a problem, he seemed to grasp it. He would focus his gaze on my body and gradually draw it out. When he was finished, he would fall asleep, exhausted from the effort. I began to see him more and more. I was grateful for the miracle he performed, and when he died, I felt that no one would ever be able to help me like he did again. I was invited to give a lecture in Jalapa, and I agreed. I would talk about extraocular vision, 12 aisle, sitting at the back of the lecture hall at the University of Veracruz. A slender blonde woman looked at me. I dedicated the lecture to her and responded to all her gestures. If she seemed enthusiastic, I trusted my speech. If she made a face of disgust, my words stumbled. Finally, he approached me and invited me to a party. I excitedly agreed. He was American and worked at the university helping to implement a master's program in education. He lived in a neighborhood in Jalapa. Loud tropical music led me to his house. Inside, everyone was dancing. Isle seemed the most uninhibited. She enjoyed every dance with an emotion and dedication that mesmerized me. I couldn't stop staring at her. Her facial expressions were exquisite, and her laugh the strangest I'd ever heard. Her body was astonishingly sensual. I approached her but couldn't follow. Timidly, I settled into a chair out of everyone's sight. At 3 a.m, I said goodbye. She approached me and made a pass at me. I invited her to visit me at my hotel the next morning. I woke up in the middle of the night sweating. My room adjoined the hotel garden. I laid a towel on the grass and did yoga. Each posture calmed me. I felt the energy ascending up my spine. I could recognize every change in my body and understood what the Hindus called chakras. Each posture activated one, and the resulting experience had its own specific quality. When I reached the generator at the top of my head, I was enveloped in a self-centered light. I needed nothing else to be completely happy. Some children were excited to see me upside down, and I helped them do the same while we all laughed. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Isle. A shiver ran through me. I asked her to come to the room, but she hesitated. She appeared 2 minutes later. I invited her in and closed the curtains. We sat facing each other on the 2 beds in the room. We looked into each other's eyes. I hadn't touched a woman in 3 years, and I felt the feminine energy coming from Isle's body. It enveloped me, and I lost myself in it. I leaned in and stroked her hair. I hugged her, and she said it was too soon for that, but she didn't pull away. We lay down, and I got to know her body. I couldn't believe her beauty. I caressed her, and she opened up to me. She told me it had been a long time since anyone had touched her like that. We made love among the clouds. She invited me to her house, and for days we didn't leave her room. There was nothing urgent in Tepoztlan, but I couldn't stand so much intimacy. Neither could she. We said our goodbyes, and as we left Jalapa, I couldn't bear to part ways. At that moment, all the alarm bells in my car went off. I'd noticed before that my emotions could disrupt the electromechanical systems of cars, but never to this degree. I figured the engine would be destroyed in a few more minutes. I cursed him and turned around. Isle was waiting for me at her house. She told me she knew I'd be back. It took a mechanic 5 days to rebuild the engine while Isle and I returned to her room. I was finally able to return to Tepoztlan. I tried to forget about the incident and managed to do so after a week. During a visit to Mexico City, 30 seconds after entering my apartment, the phone rang. It was her. She had gone to look for me in Tepoztlan. An inner voice told me not to go back to her, but another ordered me to go find her. I found her at the Tepozteco Hotel. She had transformed, and her housewife-like appearance startled me. She did everything she wanted. She was an Aries, and her strength overwhelmed me. She decided to come live with me in Tepoztlan. Afterward, we moved into my apartment in Mexico City. I stopped doing yoga and meditated for hours, trying to free myself from the ever-increasing oppression. I couldn't believe it. I was perfectly aware that I was repeating the same behavior as with P and Lizette. I missed my psychoanalyst and began to punish myself. I asked Teal to meditate with me, to do yoga, to stop smoking, and to not drink alcohol. She tried, but it was forced and reluctant. I learned that P had become the leader of the Gurdjieff organization in Mexico, and I increased my demands. Every day there was more resentment between us. We decided to try the mountains and went to live in the cabin. We returned to the city. One night I woke up freezing. It was an unfamiliar cold. I was both inside and out. I approached a radiator and couldn't warm up. I felt like I'd lost my soul, and in desperation I took refuge in her arms. I was a nobody, and I surrendered myself completely to her world. She rejected me. She never let me touch her again. I begged for love, but she refused. The entire universe became aisle, and for months I begged for affection, caresses, and love, but it was all in vain. I began to think of my life as a complete farce. My brain research was merely a pretext for understanding my mother's cancer. Pachita had been a fantasy. The entire East was shit, and I wasn't a man. I found a therapist and asked for help. She listened and agreed to give me therapy. 10 days later, I brought her all my books as a gift and said goodbye. I developed an ear infection, the same one I had at the kibbutz. I became almost deaf, and in December, Ile decided it would be great for me to meet his family in the United States. I refused at first, but then I agreed. Astucia came with us. I found her mother charming and her way of life traditional. Instead of rejecting it, I loved it. I had finally become normal. Days later, Ile returned to the United States of America. 13 India. I met dozens of women. Ile had confessed to having had sex with 36 different men, and I wanted to match her. I'd see them one day. We'd make love furiously, and I refused to have anything to do with them again. I stopped writing. I considered all my books rubbish and sided with my critics. I was crazy. I was a fraud and nothing had any meaning. I denied all my evolution and became a teenager. I enrolled at the Universidad Iberoamericana to study for a master's degree in human development. I went to the lab because I had to survive. I considered my experiments a necessary foolishness. When I entered my apartment, I was overcome with fear. I would be alone or accompanied by hundreds of ghosts who would suffocate me with their energetic demands. When I went outside, I was overcome with fear. I would have to talk to people, go to the lab, pretend I was okay. I lived in a permanent state of guilt because Lisette had asked me to take care of Astucia, and I had felt incapable of living with her. When I lay down to sleep, I was overcome with fear that I wouldn't be able to rest, or I would suffer from nightmares. When I woke up, I saw Astucia's empty bed and began to wish for death. I remembered Muktananda and visited his ashram in the Condesa neighborhood, a few blocks from my house. There are many bodies, and each of them is a matrix of interpolations only visible when observed from the outside. The organic body is one of those matrices. When an area of the body is injured, pain is felt. When you decide to move, a group of muscles is activated. When a consciousness identifies with any body, it begins to form part of the matrix of correlations that define it. Coincidences that seem magical are the result of the activation of some position in the correlation matrix of the new body. I had found Muktananda and entered a matrix of correlations in which I found information about gurus and ashwams. On the street, I saw Hindu adepts and friends visited me with information about India. One thinks that a supreme power is sending messages to direct one's life in one direction or another, and doesn't realize that the only thing that has happened to them is a mutation of bodies. However, this hypothesis is not enough to explain the sensation and experience of the existence of something that guides and protects. I decided to go to India. I was able to scrape together enough money for a one-way ticket, and I placed $1,200 in a purse that I hung around my neck. I didn't know how long it would last. I put on some hiking boots and carried an explorer's backpack on my back. When I arrived in Delhi, I was scared. There were too many people, an army of beggars, and the noise was infernal. I took a bus that took me to the Rajasthan desert. The Indians were identical to the Mexicans, and so were their landscapes. The bus stopped twice along the way. All the passengers got off to drink tea, and I joined them. They seemed to be in a constant party. They laughed at every little thing and argued angrily over insignificant details. On the road walked dignified and patient camels and sadhus with long beards and majestic turbans. A meditation center run by Goenka had been built in Rajasthan, and I was determined to take a course there. I had met Goenka at a meditation retreat in the Arizona desert and was impressed by his seriousness. At the center they collected my passport and my notebook. For 3 weeks I meditated 12 hours a day, without speaking a single word, without writing, and in the most complete asceticism. The technique consisted of observing my breathing and bodily sensations until I was able to explore my entire body, millimeter by millimeter, both on its surface and inside. Astonishing things began to happen to me. Every detail of my body, when activated, stimulated a memory from my life. I could trigger those memories at will and with extreme perfection. All I had to do was want to know what had happened on a specific date, day, and time for the event to reveal itself to my consciousness. I went through my life but couldn't observe my father with equanimity. In the end, I grew exhausted and decided to leave. I later realized that my inability to observe my father underpinned one of the most recurring themes in my life: the search for authority figures. Brust, Roy John, and now Goenka were the pieces in the mosaic of that theme. Had I been able to view my father with equanimity, my journey in search of gurus would have ended right there, but it didn't. I dedicated myself to searching for the Babaji of Haisakan. They said he was 800 years old and rejuvenated himself every 50 years in a miraculous cave near the Himalayas. I found Haisakan. It was a magical valley in the Himalayas. Babaji had died 3 days before my arrival from a heart attack. They said he couldn't bear the planetary pain and his heart had burst. His body lay next to a temple where I sat to meditate. I immediately entered into ecstasy and remained so for days. At night, there was singing and extraordinarily sensual girls with shaved heads danced. The temple's inhabitants were astonishing. Babaji had assigned each person a different role according to their personality. A Swiss doctor dressed as a joker and played jokes on everyone. Some Italians dressed completely in black and smoked hashish every evening by the river that flowed through the valley. They claimed to belong to the Black Army and worshipped Kali. Their leader walked the halls with a trident in his hand, looking like the devil. I was still in ecstasy when I met Swastegi. He had been Babaji's teacher after writing 62 treatises on the Vedas. He read my palm and told me that at 42 years old I would become a great leader of my people. I left Haisakan feeling reborn and traveled to Rishikesh, the city of saints with the Ganges at its feet and dozens of ashrams on its banks. I lived for a month with Yogi Yoganeshwar, a 98-year-old man who filled me with hope. I visited southern India and the ashram of the master of the Muktananda lineage. Everyone, men and women, meditated completely naked for 8 hours a day. Children were educated by all the adults and learned to meditate from the age of 3. I met Sai Baba in Whitefield, near the wonderful city of Bangalore. He had 1 million followers in India and performed miracles, materializing objects and a dark, talcum-like powder. Every day, he left his home in a Rolls-Royce and visited his followers. He subjected me to a test I couldn't endure. While I waited for him with his disciples, I noticed a young man whose head only had a right hemisphere. The entire left side of his skull was gone, leaving a hideous scar. I began to cry, remembering my mother, and at that moment, Sai Baba approached me, tearing my mind out with his energy. I was completely empty. I felt imminent death and crawled away. For 5 days I visited Sai Baba, feeling as though my mind was being replaced by his in order to transform me into his follower. I realized that despite my search for guidance and a teacher, I wasn't willing to sacrifice my own individuality for that of another. Later, I realized that I had projected my poorly constructed father figure onto Sai Baba. I fled to Tiruvannamalai. A young man who looked like Jesus had told me that Sri Ramana Maharshi had lived there, and that enlightenment existed in a cave where he had remained for over 20 years in complete silence. I climbed the mountain of perpetual radiance, Arunchala, and found the cave. My emptiness was filled and I thanked God. In Pondicherry, I visited the office where Sri Aurobindo had written his books announcing superconsciousness, and I recognized the same energy as Hirakan. I returned to Rishikesh, and in a small bookstore by the Ganges, I found a text about the Tibetan technique Mahamudra. I read it with enthusiasm. It was what I was looking for. I changed my body and began meeting Tibetan lamas. I decided to visit Nepal, and at the Kopan Lamazari near Kathmandu, I understood that Buddha is the pure self, situated beyond individuality and unity. The lamas seduced me. They radiated the purest energy of love and compassion. I sought out a Mahamudra teacher, and Lama Lundrup told me that Mahamudra was myself. I returned to Rishikesh and met Daniela after leaving a meditation session at the Sivananda temple. She was chatting with some monks, and her jet black hair and energy drew me to her. She was Jewish, like me, and had lived in the Yucatan Peninsula. There, she had met her teacher, a 130-year-old Mayan shaman named Don Panchito. I knew it was time to return to Mexico, but I had no money and no return ticket. I lived as a refugee in the Mexican embassy in Delhi, until my brother Jerry saved me by sending me a ticket. 14 Mexico. I met Don Panchito in a small town near Valladolid. I learned he was an expert in Mahamudra. He accepted me as a disciple, and for a week I slept in a hammock next to him. He didn't speak Spanish and communicated with me during my sleep. I changed bodies again. I realized that in Mexico there was extraordinary knowledge preserved in the practices and minds of shamans. I remembered Don Lucio Pachita, and before Don Panchito, I vowed to help rescue that knowledge. I presented a research project to CONACYT proposing its rescue. On the morning of September 19, 1985, I went for a walk in Mexico Park with my dog. Astusha lived with me, and minutes earlier I had left her on the bus that took her to school every day. The night before, I had a strange dream. I was sitting in an apartment building when, through the windows, I saw the city moving. The trees and buildings swayed from side to side. When I woke up, I'd had a disagreement with Astusha, and nervously, I'd shaken her from side to side, demanding she reconsider. Suddenly, the dog began to howl, and the pigeons in the park flew in all directions. A 14-story building adjacent to the park began to creak and sway from side to side. The ground cracked beneath my feet, and I stopped walking. It was the beginning of a terrible earthquake. A rabbi who lived near the park ran up to me. He was scared and told me to go home immediately to inspect the damage. I told him that everything in life happens for a transcendent reason and that he should calm down. He looked at me in amazement and nodded. I heard a loud bang and saw smoke coming from a house. I walked toward mine, knowing Astusha was safe. After 2 days of shock and confusion, I remembered that Teresa was married to the Secretary of Public Education. I contacted her, offering my help. We immediately drafted an emergency brochure recommending several measures to deal with what had happened. I felt it was an opportunity to introduce self-awareness and meditation techniques for teachers, and that through the psychological rift produced by the earthquake, changes could be activated that would have been rejected without it. As a result of the brochure, we created a psychopedagogical guidance workshop in which teachers learn to relax, meditate, and observe their internal processes with the goal of increasing their awareness and that of their students. For 8 months, we taught the techniques to more than 15,000 teachers while Mexico City recovered. We were all amazed by the spirit of mutual aid, love, and solidarity that had manifested among the population from the first minutes after the earthquake. It was as if a hidden soul had escaped its limiting ties and manifested itself as a sign of a marvelous inner strength. The rigid structure of government institutions seemed to be the inhibiting element of that soul, which had emerged at the moment of the cracking of external control. Working with me were psychologists from the Ministry of Public Education (SEP), and among them, a small but select group, full of idealism, began to stand out. At the same time, the project I had submitted to CONOCITE to recover the knowledge of Mexico's shamans had been approved, and I began traveling around the country to continue my study with them. In the Sierra Tarahumara, I was able to interview a native Ogiruame, and his wisdom amazed me. Excited, I called Teresa, and she suggested I take advantage of my stay in Chihuahua to tour the state's indigenous shelters and see what the Ministry of Education could do to improve the conditions of the Raramuri children living there. That was the beginning of a national program aimed not only at overcoming the deterioration into which the shelters had fallen, but also at recovering indigenous culture for the next generation. Among the actions implemented were having shamans teach children their wisdom and instruct them in medicinal plants and their traditions and knowledge. My research into shamanic wisdom and teaching it to the next generation of indigenous children fit like soft fur slippers. With the group of psychologists who had excelled during the orientation workshop, and with people selected by other SEP agencies, we developed a strategy whose main objective was to stimulate the self-management motivation of the shelter directors and the indigenous communities where they were located. In all my interactions with indigenous communities and children, I remembered Petra. She had taught me to love the heart of the indigenous person, and, as a surrogate mother, had bathed me in her spirit. I began to feel indigenous myself, and my Judaism as just another ethnic group among the 5 to 7 that survive in the country. I met extraordinary shamans throughout Mexico. I visited Don Panchito, and, with the help of Don Esara, his student, I met with the greatest Mayan sages, such as Rakpek, who spoke and could heal his sick with the help of fire. My experiences eventually convinced me of the widespread existence of secret knowledge, but living in Mexico, I found myself more and more amazed by the day. I began writing about my experiences and managed to complete 7 volumes entitled The Shamans of Mexico, which chronicled my experiences. Something inside me was propelling me with an unknown force, and I began to think that the failure to reconcile Cuauhtémoc and Quetzalcoatl during my time with Panchita was beginning to transform into success. The Cuauhtémoc within me, inherited from my contact with Panchita, was realizing that the Quetzalcoatl within me, inherited from Tepoztlan, was no longer a traitor, but was vigorously collaborating to recover what was lost. In the Secretariat, I worked under Teresa in a completely female environment. When I returned from my research trips with shamans and from self-management courses at the shelters, I was introduced to a world filled with women who also worked with Teresa. At first, I felt self-conscious, and my entire structure of feminine dominance rebelled against the power of Teresa and her collaborators. I came to no longer bear the world of feminine intrigues, strange emotions, and right brain sobriety that surrounded me. I revolted within myself, unable to accept that my former student now dared to command me with a natural and spontaneous power that trapped me. Teresa behaved like a queen, having me as her vassal, intruding into my mind through a mysterious feminine power that radiated from her, and I futilely resisted her influence until she finally overcame me. I felt like I had once again fallen under female domination, but now with an opponent much more powerful than me, aided by an army of Amazons from which I could not escape. In the afternoons I went to my laboratory at the university, and the experiments I carried out barely managed to balance my feeling of submission. Little by little I came to accept that what was happening to me was not a tragedy but a true blessing. I had repeated the same pattern too many times, and I was able to realize that I was responsible for it. I stopped blaming Teresa, God, or the devil, and I took responsibility. I don't quite understand how it happened, but after a year and a half of struggling, I began to understand women like never before and to appreciate their qualities without feeling trapped. I realized that my learned structure was driving me to lose my individuality and, defeated and nullified, enter the spirit of women. And that constant contact with the feminine power structure was teaching me to simultaneously preserve and enjoy all the emotions radiating from the bodies and minds of these creatures, seeing them from the outside rather than from the inside. Somehow, I learned to separate myself while remaining unified and, at the same time, accompanied. I realized that my past inability to separate was based on and sustained by guilt, and as I wrote this recapitulation, it became clear to me that my relationship with my ailing mother was the cause, along with all my childhood training and family heritage. I felt reborn to a new consciousness in which women and their attributes could be objects of learning and pleasure, without feeling dominated by them. Feminine tenderness, her maternal desire to improve the children's lives, and the constant displays of compassion and love I saw in Teresa and some of her collaborators, filled me with the desire to incorporate these qualities into my masculine self. A friend of Teresa's, Jacqueline, playfully mocked my transformations. She told me, laughing, that I had finally found a woman more intelligent than I was, and that this had shattered the image my mother's illness had left me of women as invalids and fools. I knew it was true, and it also made me realize I had a void, that of maternal absence, which I had always tried to fill by confusing, in all my relationships with the female sex, the image of my dead mother. With Lisette, P, and Isle, this confusion made me search for perfection in them, and when I didn't find it, I was diagnosed with illness. Teresa hadn't played along, and had managed to dismember it between my anguish and the subsequent discovery of my capacity for separation and acceptance. My work in the research laboratory was motivated by a desire to understand consciousness and was based on a series of theoretical postulates about the creation of experience. I was motivated by my synergistic theory, which posited that the origin of perception is the interaction of two fields. On the one hand, one produced by the brain, the neuronal field, and on the other, the very structure of space itself, the lattice or quantum field. Each time the brain modified its activity, a different interaction was established, and this changed the experience. A kind of interference pattern was created that contained the energetic structure of an image, and this could vary, but was only congruent and clear in certain bands. Since my experience with Pachita, I realized that this interaction wasn't enough. It was necessary to consider the existence of a factor independent of the lattice, endowed with its own consciousness and charged with infusing that attribute into the interference pattern. However, my experiences with shamans began to place me in a more monistic perspective. If Don Lucio was capable of talking to the clouds and convincing lightning not to strike the cornfields, if Don Rakpek talked to the fire, and Don Panchito conversed with the dawn, wouldn't it be possible to think that consciousness wasn't radiated by an independent factor, but rather possessed by everything? If this were the case, both the lattice and any of its distortions, from an elementary particle to a neuron and a brain, possessed consciousness, but to a varying degree depending on their complexity. However, I couldn't accept that something outside of the lattice didn't exist. Within myself, I felt the presence of the observer, capable of witnessing all my ideas, emotions, and thoughts, as if its existence were independent and transcendent. The observer existed and was able to observe the lattice itself from outside, as if it were a creature independent of it. I knew that my debate about the existence of unity in the lattice, without something independent of it, versus the consideration of a factor that transcended it, reflected, in my mental processes, what was happening to me in life. My recent ability to separate from the woman supported the independent factor hypothesis. My longing to remain united with the woman emotionally stimulated the consideration of unity. The possibility of remaining united and independent simultaneously had to be the impossible but dialectical solution to the dilemma. I remembered that with Pachita, the concern about individuality versus unity had also assailed me, and I recognized in her a recurring theme throughout my life. Knowing that my psychophysiological ideas were based on my existential dilemmas no longer made me doubt the former. Before, realizing this psychological participation would have put me in a difficult position. Now, I knew that absolute objectivism was an ancient legacy of classical mechanics. Furthermore, I recognized the beauty of my contradictions and the vital commitment to understanding them. I loved myself more than before, and that was okay. In my most lucid moments, I thought about all of the above and tried to clarify my ideas. Deep down, I still longed to find someone capable of helping me resolve my doubts. One afternoon, I received an invitation to attend a special meeting. At it, Carlos Castaneda would present the contents of his new book, The Fire Within. I had followed Castaneda's work with the utmost interest. His descriptions of Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui shaman from Sonora, amazed me. In fact, I had tried to find Don Juan, but was unsuccessful. Sometime after that session with Castaneda, I had even traveled throughout Yaqui territory looking for shamans and descendants of the Matus family. Near Vicam, I had met Doña Maria Matus, who amazed me with her power and wisdom. In the Yaqui territory's civil registry, I searched for Don Juan Matus's birth certificate. While I was doing so, assisted by the local justice of the peace, an indigenous woman had arrived to register her son. Astonished, I heard that the child's name was precisely Juan Matus. This was God's supreme joke. I asked the mother to allow me to appear as a witness on the record, and seeing the child's eyes gave me a premonition. I wasn't able to find Don Juan's birth certificate, but I met another shaman who described him to me. She had treated him for years, and that convinced me that his existence was real, and not a product of Castaneda's fantasy. About 30 people attended the meeting. We all eagerly awaited Castaneda's arrival, trying to guess what he would look like. Suddenly, a thin, dark-skinned, impeccably dressed man appeared, radiating sparkling energy. His movements were fluid, intelligent, and completely natural. Within 5 minutes of hearing him, I was captivated by his energy and presence. He began to talk about two types of energy, one internal and the other external. The internal energy was formed by bands of emanations that, when aligned with the external energy, also formed by bands, produced perception. I was extremely surprised. I was hearing my own thoughts but expressed in different terminology. Castaneda went on to explain that alignment is modulated by a focusing mechanism that Don Juan called the assemblage point. According to him, the assemblage point can vary its position, aligning different bands of emanations with it. Each position produces a different perceptual world, a different reality. It had to be situated outside the interaction, but capable of exerting control over it. There was a difference between the directionality factor postulated by my theory and the assemblage point. The former modulates the location of the conscious ego presence within the interference pattern within the lattice. Its changes in position allow the observer to appear inside or outside the body. Its postulation was derived from the shamanic ability to travel outside the body and locate consciousness in different places at will. Pachita did this daily, just like Don Lucio and Don Panchito. Instead, the assemblage point Castaneda spoke of seemed to correspond to the brain itself, which, by altering its activity, affected the neuronal field, and therefore the interference pattern resulting from its interaction with the lattice. The positions of the assemblage point seemed to correspond to and refer to the different levels that brain activity could assume, and therefore the awareness of different realities. The consideration that the assemblage point was located in a specific position in the body disagreed with the above, but it was precisely what Castaneda defended. For me, it was nothing more than a simplification or a metaphor. Carlos Castaneda opened the floor for questions, and I raised my hand. I asked him about the observer, and he laughed. He told me that it was only a fragment of the personality. I felt he had misunderstood me. I insisted again, but he treated it as a joke. I left the meeting feeling simultaneously frustrated and elated. Castaneda had said that the goal of Don Juan's teachings was to move the assemblage point from its fixed position in order to gain access to other realities. Then, achieving simultaneous focus on the assemblage point in all its possible positions caused the person who achieved this to disappear from this world with their consciousness intact, thus achieving total freedom. This activation was the inner fire, and from it the title of his book. Don Juan had already achieved this wonder, and was now free in the immensity of the other world. When I returned home that night, I began to suspect that the ideas I'd assumed were mine had actually been given to me by Don Juan from the other world. I thought my neural field had managed to interact with Don Juan in some area of the lattice. In my theory, there is also a modulator of the interaction between the neuronal field and the lattice, but I called it the directionality factor and postulated it to be controlled by the central processor, which is simply the independent factor with the attribute of consciousness. The observer was the central processor, and yet it later became clear to me that, in reality, the knowledge we were talking about originated in the East. I remembered that Don Juan's shaman friend had told me that he had traveled extensively and had once lived in Morocco. In the Buddhist technique of Vipassana, one practiced observing the contents of experience. According to this technique, personal development involves the ability to expand observation to an ever-increasing number of experiences, until one is able to observe them all simultaneously. When this was achieved, liberation was achieved because restricted identifications no longer existed. I wrote a book titled Self-Illusion Meditation, explaining this technique and its theoretical basis. In the laboratory, I investigated the relationship between brain activity and the expansion of the capacity for simultaneous observation. The relationship between cerebral coherence and the capacity for inclusion was clear. Several days later, I attended another meeting, this time more intimate, where I was able to converse with Castaneda without interruption. I insisted again about the observer, and this time he didn't mock me. He spoke to me about intent, and told me it was the command behind the different positions of the assemblage point. Intent, according to Don Juan, is the force that maintains the universe and sustains our perception. I understood that Pachita had enjoyed direct contact with intent, and that her exploits and miracles stemmed from there. Furthermore, I realized that my understanding of reality oscillated between a purely analytical understanding, in which I explained events as associated, with a change in the energy body, and an idealistic vision that affirmed that not everything was explainable, and that a supreme power guided, call it observer, intent, or God. I sensed that this conversation was a new piece of the puzzle for understanding unity and individuality. I sometimes experienced the existence of intent as a force that illuminated me from within, giving direct meaning to everything. Don Panchito had told me that he perceived in me a mystical spirit from other ages living in a body that on this occasion had decided to become a scientist. That, in his opinion, was a serious mistake. I felt that Don Panchito was right, but I couldn't escape my training, and besides, the results of it helped me understand and understand. It was vital to me. It had happened to me before that magnificent intuitions crumbled when I subjected them to judgments of understanding. The worst were the result of psychological considerations I continually resorted to. Suddenly, when faced with Don Panchito or another shaman, my rational mind told me that these people merely represented a pathological search for a paternal figure. At that moment, I stopped understanding the knowledge being offered to me and began to view the shaman with indignant eyes. I didn't understand that this was a trap of my ego, but I had also learned to observe my judgments, and that rescued me from the abyss of disbelief I was about to enter. A friend of Castaneda's, Carlos Ortiz, organized a conference on the frontiers of science in Costa Rica and invited me to present a paper. I immediately accepted. I had always wanted to visit Castaneda's country, and this was my chance. Costa Rica amazed me with its freshness and greenery, but disappointed me with its dependence on the United States. Halfway through the Congress, a woman approached me who introduced herself as a lawyer at the Costa Rican Supreme Court. She confessed that she was attending the Congress in order to acquire information that would help her litigate a lawsuit that Costa Rican doctors were bringing against Adita, a very young shaman. I was immediately interested. What the lawyer wanted was my opinion on the veracity of the powers Adita claimed to possess. She told me that her client worked as a healer in a small town, and that sometimes lines of sick people formed along the entire length of the town to see her. The doctors, frightened by this success, had sued her for practicing medicine without a license. Another speaker at the conference was Andrea Pujaric. Together we traveled to Adita's village and met her. She was slender, small like a child, but possessed immense power. A group of specialists had seen her operate on a patient. Her testimony was recorded in a notarized document. Adita had placed a small pile of salt on the affected area, and then stood a few feet away from the patient in full view of everyone. For 30 minutes, she concentrated on treating him. When she finished, everyone gathered around and could see that there was blood, organic matter, and a scar on the skin over the affected area. The patient had been healed after this miraculous operation performed from a distance. Adita was sitting in an armchair, and her presence immediately reminded me of Pachita's. They both seemed to be connected to the same energy band. In a report, we certified a favorable opinion on the case. The lawyer was very happy and confessed to me that she had an extraordinary teacher. I asked to meet her, but she told me that was impossible. 2 months later, the lawyer traveled to Mexico and located me. She told me that her teacher had instructed her to climb the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan barefoot on a full moon night, and that I should accompany her. I asked her the reasons, but she refused to tell me. During a shamanic session at Ivan Ramon's house, to which I had invited her, the lawyer insisted on her request. I reluctantly agreed, and together we traveled to Teotihuacan. We jumped over a fence and took off our shoes. We climbed the pyramid while the moon illuminated us with creamy hues. At the top, the lawyer performed a ritual while I felt an energy that was impossible to bear. She invited me to Costa Rica to meet her teacher. When I saw her, I realized she was a Cancer. She lived in isolation after rising from the ground in her village, in full view of the entire congregation of faithful, to remain levitating near the ceiling inside the church. She had been considered a saint, but was later persecuted because the parish priest had informed the community that she was a witch. She had only one friend who understood her, an indigenous woman who, at the age of 14, had been given to the elder Sukya of a tribe. She had lived with him until her death at 140. Her husband had taught her to communicate with other realities, to heal, and to move enormous rocks. Together we traveled through Costa Rica looking for signs of Atlantis. The lawyer and her teacher dedicated themselves to collecting magic stones that had belonged to the ancient shamans of Costa Rica. Each stone determined a specific position of the assemblage point and caused whoever held it to shift their consciousness. To me, it seemed like a remnant of a magnificent art from ancient times. Upon returning to Mexico, my forearms began to blacken, as if a powerful energy had burned them. For months I waited for her color to return to normal. I attributed the phenomenon to a session we had held in the jungle, on a huge rock that was the ritual site of the indigenous shaman friend of the lawyer's teacher. We had called upon the spirits of the other world by playing a melody on a rock. A chilling voice answered us from the jungle, and we all fell, as if struck dead, onto the rock, our hair standing on end. Meanwhile, Nathan and Jerry had married two Sagittarians born on December 11 and 14. I teased them by saying that both of them had failed to become independent of their older brother, and that was why their wives were circling around my birth date. They began to have daughters and give them all the love they had been deprived of in their childhood. Abraham didn't want to be called a grandfather and barely saw his granddaughters. My daughter's maternal grandparents had died, and the only surviving member of the paternal branch, my father, seemed unaware of their existence. We all wondered when he would change. Petra had told me that old age would soften him, and that his heart would be reborn as he realized everything he had lost in the past. Ari had become an artist, and began appearing in plays and on television. We were very proud of her inner strength, and admired her optimism. I owed myself a debt for not finishing my PhD in New York. I had decided to do it, and in between my travels, I studied at the Faculty of Medicine until I finished it. I began to feel cleansed of the past, and decided to recapitulate it by writing this book.